Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a crime storytelling series for sleeping where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we focus on longer historical crime stories. Let's go. Blood in the Fields, the Peasants' Revolt Murders of 1381. The year 1381 would be remembered as one of the bloodiest in English medieval history, when the accumulated grievances of generations exploded into a wave of violence that swept across the countryside like wildfire. What began as protests against unfair taxation would transform into a systematic campaign of murder and destruction that claimed hundreds of lives and brought the kingdom to the brink of collapse. The Peasants' Revolt, as it would come to be known, was not merely a spontaneous uprising of the oppressed masses. It was a carefully orchestrated revolution that employed murder as both a tool of intimidation and a method of social restructuring. The killings that characterized this revolt were not random acts of mob violence, but calculated executions designed to eliminate entire classes of people deemed enemies of the common folk. From the marshes of Essex to the cobbled streets of London, from the great estates of Kent to the cathedral cities of East Anglia, a reign of terror unfolded that would fundamentally alter the relationship between ruler and ruled in medieval England. The revolt's leaders understood that words alone could not break the chains of feudal oppression. Only blood could wash away centuries of injustice. The men who orchestrated these killings were not common criminals seeking personal gain, but revolutionary leaders who viewed murder as a necessary tool for social transformation. They created lists of enemies, organized execution squads, and developed systematic methods for identifying and eliminating those they considered oppressors of the common people. This is the story of how England's peasants pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, chose violence as their path to freedom, and how their campaign of systematic murder brought a kingdom to its knees. It is a tale of revolutionary terror that would echo through the centuries, providing a template for future uprisings and demonstrating the awesome power of popular rage when directed with murderous intent. The events of 1381 would prove that in medieval society, the line between justice and vengeance, between revolution and terrorism, between liberation and annihilation, was measured not in moral absolutes, but in the blood of those who died in the fields, towns, and cities of a kingdom convulsed by unprecedented violence. The seeds of the murderous uprising that would convulse England in 1381 were planted decades earlier in the social and economic upheavals that followed the Black Death. The plague that swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351 killed an estimated one-third of England's population, fundamentally altering the balance of power between landlords and laborers in ways that would prove explosive when combined with royal incompetence and economic exploitation. Before the plague, England's feudal system had operated on the principle of abundant labor and scarce land. Peasants, bound to their lords' estates through the system of serfdom, had little choice but to accept whatever conditions were imposed upon them. The social hierarchy was rigid and seemingly immutable, with each class knowing its place and accepting its fate as ordained by God and enforced by law. The Black Death shattered this ancient order overnight. With a third of the population dead, surviving peasants found themselves in unprecedented demand. Labor became scarce while land remained plentiful, reversing the fundamental economic equation that had sustained feudalism for centuries. Peasants began demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and increased personal freedom, while landlords struggled to maintain their traditional privileges in the face of economic reality. The royal government's response to these changes was both predictable and catastrophic. Rather than allowing market forces to establish new relationships between classes, Parliament enacted the Statute of Labours in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from moving freely in search of better conditions. This legislation created a powder keg of resentment that would explode 30 years later in an orgy of violence. The enforcement of the Statute of Labourers required an expanded bureaucracy of royal officials, tax collectors, and justices who became increasingly hated figures throughout rural England. These men, drawn primarily from the emerging middle class of merchants and lawyers, were seen by peasants as parasites who grew rich by enforcing unjust laws and collecting oppressive taxes. Their names would later appear on death lists compiled by rebel leaders. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, an effective ruler of England, during his nephew Richard II's minority, embodied everything that the common people had come to despise about their rulers. Wealthy beyond measure, politically powerful, and seemingly indifferent to popular suffering, he became a focal point for peasant hatred and a primary target for assassination during the revolt. The poll tax of 1380 proved to be the final straw that transformed simmering resentment into murderous rage. This regressive tax, which required the same payment from rich and poor alike, was seen as the ultimate expression of governmental indifference to popular welfare. When tax collectors arrived in villages throughout England, they encountered not merely resistance, but organized violence that would escalate into systematic murder. The most notorious of these tax collectors was John Bampton, whose heavy-handed methods in Essex would trigger the first murders of the revolt. Bampton's approach to tax collection involved intimidation, threats, and the seizure of property from those unable to pay. His victims included widows, orphans, and disabled individuals who had no means of meeting his demands, but faced imprisonment or worse if they failed to comply. The social tensions that preceded the revolt were exacerbated by a religious upheaval associated with the teachings of John Wycliffe and his followers, known as Lollards. These religious reformers preached radical doctrines that challenged not only church authority, but the entire social order, arguing that all men were equal in God's sight and that the accumulation of wealth by nobles and clergy was contrary to Christian principles. Wycliffe's teachings provided intellectual justification for what would become a campaign of class-based murder. If all men were truly equal before God, then the artificial distinctions created by feudal society were not only unjust, but sinful. The elimination of those who maintained these unjust distinctions could therefore be seen as righteous work, sanctioned by divine authority. The influence of Lollard preachers throughout England created networks of like-minded individuals who would form the core of the rebel organization. These men, educated enough to read and write, but excluded from positions of real power by their common birth, became the ideological leaders who would transform peasant anger into revolutionary action. Among the most influential of these radical preachers was John Ball, whose inflammatory sermons had been stirring popular unrest for years before the revolt erupted. Ball's famous couplet, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" became a rallying cry that justified the most extreme violence against the nobility and their supporters. Ball's teachings went beyond simple equality to advocate active resistance against oppression. He preached that the common people had not only the right, but the duty to eliminate those who kept them in bondage. This theological justification for murder would prove crucial in overcoming the moral inhibitions that might otherwise have restrained peasant violence. The organization that would direct the revolt's campaign of systematic murder began forming in the months before the uprising erupted. Secret meetings were held in churches, taverns, and private homes throughout southeastern England, where plans were made and target lists compiled. These gatherings were carefully organized to avoid detection by royal agents, while building the network of communication and command that would coordinate the revolt. The rebels developed a sophisticated understanding of their enemies' vulnerabilities and the most effective methods for eliminating them. They identified key figures whose deaths would maximize disruption to the existing order while minimizing organized resistance to their cause. Royal officials, tax collectors, lawyers, and foreign merchants were all marked for death in what amounted to a comprehensive plan for social revolution through systematic assassination. The psychological preparation for mass murder required overcoming centuries of social conditioning that taught peasants to accept their subordinate status and respect their social superiors. The rebel leaders accomplished this through a combination of religious instruction, political education, and careful selection of initial targets whose elimination would demonstrate both the possibility and the necessity of violent action. The choice of specific individuals to be killed was not random, but reflected careful analysis of their roles in maintaining the oppressive system. Lawyers who enforced unjust laws, officials who collected unfair taxes, and landlords who exploited their tenants were all identified as legitimate targets whose elimination would serve the greater good of social transformation. As spring turned to summer in 1381, the final preparations for revolt were completed. Weapons were stockpiled, communication and networks activated, and hit lists distributed to local rebel commanders. The stage was set for an explosion of violence that would transform England forever and demonstrate that even the most entrenched social systems could be swept away by the organized fury of the oppressed masses. The men and women who prepared for revolution in the early months of 1381 understood that they were embarking on a campaign that would require them to become killers. They accepted this necessity not from bloodlust or criminal intent, but from a desperate conviction that only through the systematic elimination of their oppressors could they achieve the freedom and justice that had been denied to them for generations. The revolt that was about to begin would prove that, when pushed beyond endurance, even the most downtrodden people could become instruments of terror, transforming their suffering into systematic violence that would claim hundreds of lives and shake the foundations of medieval England. The transformation of peasant discontent into systematic murder began on May 30th, 1381, in the Essex market town of Brentwood, where a routine tax collection expedition became the spark that ignited a revolution. The events of that day would establish the pattern of targeted killings that would characterize the entire revolt, demonstrating how quickly social frustration could evolve into organized violence when directed by determined leaders. John Bampton arrived in Brentwood that morning with the arrogant confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating peasants into compliance. As a royal commissioner for tax collection, he had successfully extracted money from dozens of villages throughout Essex, using a combination of legal threats and physical intimidation to overcome resistance. He had no reason to expect that Brentwood would prove any different from the other communities he had terrorized. The peasants of Fobbing, a nearby village, had been summoned to appear before Bampton to account for their alleged shortfalls in poll tax payments. These men, led by a baker named Thomas Carter, arrived in Brentwood prepared not merely to resist the tax collector's demands, but to eliminate him entirely. They had spent weeks planning this confrontation, organizing themselves into a disciplined force capable of carrying out predetermined assassination targets. The meeting between Bampton and the Fobbing peasants took place in the town's market square, where the tax collector had established his tribunal with the pomp and ceremony typical of royal officials. Surrounded by his clerks and guards, Bampton read the formal charges against the assembled peasants and demanded immediate payment of their outstanding obligations. Thomas Carter's response was not the groveling submission that Bampton expected, but a clear declaration of defiance that had been carefully rehearsed in secret meetings held throughout the preceding weeks. Carter announced that the peasants of Fobbing rejected the authority of royal tax collectors and would no longer submit to exploitation by corrupt officials who grew rich from the suffering of honest working people. The confrontation quickly escalated from verbal defiance to physical violence when Bampton ordered his guards to arrest the rebellious peasants. However, the rebels had anticipated this response and were prepared for battle. They had concealed weapons throughout the crowd and positioned additional supporters in strategic locations around the market square. The first death of the peasants' revolt was one of Bampton's guards, a sergeant-at-arms named Robert Belknap, who was killed when he attempted to seize Thomas Carter. The manner of Belknap's death, he was beaten to death with agricultural tools by multiple attackers, established the brutal pattern that would characterize rebel executions throughout the uprising. Bampton himself managed to escape the initial assault, fleeing on horseback toward London with several of his surviving officials. However, his escape was temporary, as the rebels had organized pursuit parties specifically to prevent such flight. He was overtaken several miles from Brentwood and brought back to the market square for public execution. The killing of John Bampton was not a spontaneous act of mob violence, but a carefully orchestrated execution designed to send a clear message to other royal officials throughout England. The rebels stripped him of his official regalia and forced him to renounce his allegiance to the crown before cutting his throat in full view of the assembled crowd. The systematic nature of the Brentwood killings became apparent when the rebels proceeded to hunt down and execute every member of Bampton's party who had not managed to escape. His clerks, guards, and servants were tracked down throughout the town and killed without mercy, their bodies left in public places as warnings to other agents of royal authority. The execution methods employed by the rebels revealed both their fury and their inexperience with large-scale killing. Most victims were beaten to death with farm implements, though some were stabbed with kitchen knives or crude weapons fashioned from agricultural tools. The violence was brutal and prolonged, suggesting that the killers were motivated as much by revenge as by revolutionary purpose. The psychological impact of the Brentwood massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect royal officials throughout southeastern England. News of Bampton's death and the systematic elimination of his party spread rapidly through the network of government administrators, creating panic and causing many to flee their posts rather than risk similar fates. Thomas Carter emerged from the Brentwood massacre as one of the revolt's first recognized leaders, demonstrating the organizational skills and ruthless determination that would characterize the rebellion's command structure. He immediately began recruiting additional followers and organizing them into disciplined units capable of carrying out coordinated attacks against predetermined targets. The rebels' actions at Brentwood also revealed their sophisticated understanding of propaganda and psychological warfare. They ensured that news of their victory spread quickly throughout Essex and beyond, using the deaths of royal officials as recruiting tools to attract additional supporters to their cause. The selection of victims at Brentwood followed a clear pattern that would be repeated throughout the revolt. Royal officials, tax collectors, and anyone associated with the enforcement of unpopular laws were marked for death, while ordinary townspeople who had not collaborated with the authorities were generally spared. The aftermath of the Brentwood massacre saw the establishment of the First Rebel Court, where Thomas Carter and his associates began compiling comprehensive lists of enemies to be eliminated throughout Essex. These lists included not only royal officials, but also local landlords, lawyers, and merchants who were seen as exploiters of the common people. The organizational structure that emerged from the Brentwood killings became the template for rebel operations throughout England. Local leaders were appointed to coordinate attacks in their areas. Communication networks were established to share intelligence about enemy movements, and execution squads were formed to carry out assassinations of high-priority targets. The weapons captured during the Brentwood massacre provided the rebels with their first significant military resources, including swords, crossbows, and official documents that could be used to identify other targets for elimination. The rebels also seized Bampton's treasury, providing them with funds to support their expanding operations. The success at Brentwood emboldened peasants throughout southeastern England to begin their own campaigns of violence against local authorities. Within days of the massacre, similar attacks were reported in villages throughout Essex, Kent, and Hertfordshire, as the example set by Thomas Carter inspired imitators throughout the region. The royal government's response to the Brentwood massacre revealed the extent to which the authorities were unprepared for organized peasant resistance. Rather than immediately dispatching military forces to suppress the rebellion, officials in London initially treated the incident as a local disturbance that could be contained through conventional law enforcement methods. This underestimation of the revolt's scope and organization proved to be a crucial mistake that allowed the rebellion to spread and consolidate its position throughout southeastern England. The delay in military response gave the rebels time to organize their forces, eliminate additional enemies, and recruit thousands of new followers to their cause. The ideological significance of the Brentwood massacre extended beyond its immediate tactical success to demonstrate that royal authority could be successfully challenged through organized violence. The systematic elimination of government officials showed that the apparatus of feudal oppression was vulnerable to determined assault by the common people. The precedent established at Brentwood that enemies of the people could and should be killed without mercy would guide rebel actions throughout the revolt. The pattern of identifying targets, organizing attacks, and carrying out public executions became the standard operating procedure for rebel forces throughout England. The transformation of Thomas Carter and his followers from oppressed peasants into efficient killers demonstrated the speed with which social revolution could alter individual behavior and group dynamics. Men who had never engaged in violence beyond occasional tavern brawls became capable of systematic murder when convinced that their cause was just and their methods necessary. The Brentwood massacre marked the point of no return for the peasants' revolt, transforming what might have remained a local tax protest into a revolutionary war that would convulse England for months to come. The blood spilled in that Essex market square announced to the world that medieval England's peasants had chosen violence as their path to freedom and would not be deterred by moral qualms or legal restrictions from pursuing their goals through systematic elimination of their enemies. In the chaos and carnage that followed the Brentwood massacre, a new leader emerged who would transform the peasants' revolt from a series of localized killings into a coordinated campaign of systematic murder. Wat Tyler, whose background remains shrouded in mystery, possessed the organizational genius and ruthless determination necessary to forge scattered bands of angry peasants into an efficient killing machine that would terrorize southeastern England for months. Tyler's origins are disputed by historians, with some sources identifying him as a Tyler from Kent, hence his surname, while others suggest he was a former soldier with experience in the French wars. What is certain is that by June 1381, he had established himself as the supreme commander of rebel forces throughout Kent and Essex, wielding authority that was both absolute and deadly. The organizational structure that Tyler imposed on the rebel forces revealed a sophisticated understanding of military tactics and revolutionary strategy. He divided his followers into specialized units: intelligence gatherers who identified targets for elimination, execution squads responsible for carrying out assassinations, and terror units whose job was to intimidate potential opponents through displays of extreme violence. Tyler's approach to target selection was systematic and comprehensive, going far beyond the opportunistic killings that had characterized the early phases of the revolt. He maintained detailed lists of enemies that included not only royal officials and tax collectors, but also lawyers, foreign merchants, educated clergy, and anyone suspected of literacy or learning, groups that Tyler viewed as inherently hostile to the interests of the common people. The rebel leader's hatred of literacy stemmed from his understanding that written documents were the primary tools used to oppress the peasantry. Tax records, legal writs, manor rolls, and court proceedings all required literate officials to create and enforce them. By eliminating anyone capable of reading and writing, Tyler believed he could strike at the root of the feudal system that had enslaved the common people for centuries. This anti-intellectual campaign led to some of the revolt's most horrific massacres, as rebels systematically hunted down and killed anyone suspected of education or learning. Monks, scribes, clerks, and even children who showed signs of literacy were murdered with particular brutality, their deaths serving as warnings to others who might be tempted to acquire dangerous knowledge. Tyler's military innovations extended beyond target selection to encompass new methods of execution designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing rebel casualties. He developed techniques for surrounding and overwhelming isolated groups of enemies, ensuring that few targets escaped to warn others or organize resistance. The most notorious of these tactics involved the use of beheading parties, specialized execution squads trained to decapitate victims with single sword strokes. These units operated with assembly line efficiency, processing dozens of prisoners in rapid succession, while crowds of supporters cheered their work. The severed heads were then displayed on pikes as trophies and warnings. Tyler's organizational genius was perhaps most evident in his development of communication networks that allowed coordinated attacks across wide geographic areas. Using a system of messengers, signals, and prearranged meeting points, he could orchestrate simultaneous strikes against multiple targets, maximizing the psychological impact of rebel violence while preventing authorities from organizing effective countermeasures. The rebel leaders' intelligence operations were remarkably sophisticated, employing spies and informants throughout southeastern England to gather information about enemy movements and vulnerabilities. These networks allowed Tyler to stay one step ahead of government forces while identifying new targets for elimination. Tyler's personal involvement in executions was both strategic and psychological, demonstrating to his followers that he shared their commitment to revolutionary violence while establishing his credentials as a leader willing to get his hands bloody for the cause. Contemporary accounts describe him personally beheading dozens of victims, his skill with a sword earning him a fearsome reputation among both followers and enemies. The psychological profile that emerges from contemporary accounts suggests that Tyler was a charismatic sociopath who combined genuine leadership abilities with a complete lack of moral restraint. He appeared to derive genuine pleasure from killing while maintaining the political sophistication necessary to direct a complex military campaign. Tyler's treatment of captured enemies revealed the systematic nature of his approach to revolutionary terror. Rather than simply killing prisoners immediately, he often subjected them to public trials where their crimes against the common people were cataloged before large audiences. These proceedings served both as propaganda exercises and as methods for identifying additional targets for elimination. The kangaroo courts established by Tyler followed a predictable pattern. The accused was charged with oppressing the common people, evidence was presented by rebel witnesses, and the inevitable death sentence was carried out immediately. These trials provided a veneer of legality to what were essentially predetermined executions while educating spectators about rebel ideology. Tyler's expansion of the revolt's geographical scope required the development of new logistical capabilities to support operations across multiple counties. He established supply lines for weapons and provisions, created rest areas for traveling execution squads, and organized safe houses where rebel leaders could meet to coordinate their activities. The weapons used by Tyler's forces evolved from the crude agricultural implements employed in the early massacres to include captured military equipment and professionally manufactured weapons. The rebels' growing sophistication in arms and armor reflected their transformation from an angry mob into a disciplined military force capable of challenging royal authority. Tyler's strategic vision extended beyond immediate revolutionary goals to encompass the creation of a new social order based on the complete elimination of existing power structures. He envisioned a society where literacy would be banned, foreign influences eliminated, and all authority concentrated in the hands of representatives chosen by the common people. The implementation of this vision required the systematic elimination of everyone associated with the old order, a task that Tyler approached with methodical efficiency. His hit lists eventually included thousands of names, representing a significant percentage of England's educated and propertied classes. Tyler's relationship with other rebel leaders was characterized by a combination of cooperation and competition, as local commanders sought to maintain their autonomy while benefiting from his organizational expertise. This tension occasionally erupted into violence, with Tyler personally eliminating rivals who challenged his authority or questioned his methods. The geographic expansion of Tyler's operations brought him into contact with urban populations whose motivations and methods differed significantly from those of his rural followers. The integration of city dwellers into his organizational structure required new approaches to recruitment and indoctrination that tested his leadership abilities. Tyler's influence on the revolt's ideological development was profound, as his systematic approach to target selection and execution methods became the standard throughout rebel-controlled territories. His emphasis on the elimination of literacy and learning would have long-lasting consequences for English society, creating educational disruptions that persisted long after the revolt was suppressed. The logistical challenges of managing a geographically dispersed campaign of systematic murder required Tyler to develop administrative capabilities that rivaled those of the royal government he sought to overthrow. His success in meeting these challenges demonstrated both his organizational genius and the depth of popular support for his revolutionary program. Tyler's personal charisma was crucial to maintaining unity among diverse rebel factions, as his ability to inspire followers and intimidate opponents kept the coalition together, despite internal tensions and external pressures. His speeches to rebel assemblies were described by contemporaries as mesmerizing performances that could transform ordinary peasants into enthusiastic killers. The systematic nature of Tyler's approach to revolutionary violence represented a significant evolution from the spontaneous brutality that had characterized earlier peasant uprisings. His methods would influence subsequent rebellions throughout Europe, establishing precedents for organized terror that would resurface in later revolutionary movements. The arrival of Wat Tyler's rebel army at the gates of London on June 12, 1381, marked the beginning of the most systematic and devastating urban massacre in medieval English history. What followed was not merely a riot or a random outbreak of violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of extermination that would claim hundreds of lives and demonstrate the terrifying effectiveness of organized revolutionary terror when applied in an urban setting. Tyler's army, now swollen to an estimated 60,000 followers drawn from across southeastern England, had spent weeks preparing for the assault on London. Intelligence networks established within the city had identified key targets for elimination, while sympathetic residents had been recruited to provide guidance and support once the killing began. The rebels were not entering London as raiders seeking plunder, but as executioners implementing a predetermined plan for social revolution through systematic murder. The city's defenses, formidable though they were, proved inadequate against an enemy that attacked from within as well as without. As Tyler's forces approached the city walls, rebel sympathizers within London began opening gates and lowering bridges, while others initiated attacks on predetermined targets throughout the urban area. The coordination of these activities revealed the sophisticated planning that had preceded the assault. The first major massacre occurred at the Tower of London, where the rebels had identified a concentration of their most hated enemies. Archbishop Simon Sudbury, Chancellor of England and architect of the despised poll tax, had taken refuge in the tower along with other high-ranking officials. Their presence transformed the fortress into a symbol of everything the rebels sought to destroy. The siege of the tower was brief but devastating, as Tyler's forces employed both direct assault and psychological warfare to overcome the defenders. Rebel agents within the fortress provided intelligence about defensive weaknesses while spreading panic through rumors and threats. When the outer defenses finally collapsed, the massacre that followed was unprecedented in its brutality and systematic nature. Archbishop Sudbury's execution became the centerpiece of the Tower Massacre, serving both as revenge for his role in creating the poll tax and as a demonstration of rebel power. Tyler personally supervised the Archbishop's beheading, which was carried out with ceremonial precision before a crowd of thousands. The victim's head was then paraded through London on a pike, becoming a trophy that symbolized the revolt's power to eliminate even the highest-ranking enemies. Sir Robert Hales, the King's Treasurer and another architect of royal tax policy, met a similar fate. His execution was preceded by a public trial in which he was forced to confess his crimes against the common people before being beheaded with a single sword stroke. The systematic nature of these proceedings revealed Tyler's understanding of the propaganda value of public executions. The massacre at the Tower was only the beginning of a campaign of urban terror that would engulf London for 3 days. Tyler's forces had compiled comprehensive lists of targets throughout the city, including not only government officials, but also foreign merchants, lawyers, and anyone associated with literacy or learning. These lists had been distributed to specialized execution squads that fanned out across London to carry out predetermined assassinations. The systematic hunting of foreign residents represented one of the revolt's most disturbing aspects, as Tyler's xenophobic ideology transformed ethnic and cultural differences into death sentences. Flemish weavers, Italian merchants, and French craftsmen were tracked down and killed regardless of their individual circumstances or behavior. The rebels' hatred of foreigners was based on economic resentment and cultural prejudice that Tyler had skillfully exploited to maintain unity among his diverse followers. The assault on the Savoy Palace, magnificent London residence of John of Gaunt, demonstrated the rebels' sophisticated understanding of symbolic warfare. Rather than simply looting the palace, Tyler's forces systematically destroyed it, burning valuable furnishings and artwork while searching for hidden enemies. The destruction was so complete that the palace was never rebuilt, serving as a permanent monument to rebel power. The execution methods employed during the London massacre revealed both the rebels' inexperience with large-scale killing and their determination to overcome logistical challenges through brutal efficiency. Beheading remained the preferred method for high-ranking victims, but the sheer number of targets required the development of alternative techniques, including mass hangings, drownings, and beatings. The psychological impact of the London massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims to terrorize the entire urban population. Citizens who had not been targeted for elimination were forced to witness systematic executions of their neighbors and colleagues, creating an atmosphere of terror that paralyzed normal urban life. Tyler's control over his forces during the London massacre demonstrated remarkable organizational discipline, as tens of thousands of armed peasants carried out coordinated attacks while avoiding the random violence that typically characterized medieval urban riots. This discipline was maintained through a combination of ideological indoctrination and brutal punishment for those who violated orders. The rebels' ability to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent bystanders revealed the sophistication of their intelligence networks and the clarity of their revolutionary ideology. Citizens who had not participated in the oppression of peasants were generally spared, while those identified as enemies of the common people were hunted down with relentless efficiency. The economic disruption caused by the London Massacre was immediate and severe, as the systematic elimination of merchants, bankers, and skilled craftsmen paralyzed commercial activity throughout the city. The rebels' understanding of urban economics led them to target specific individuals whose deaths would maximize economic chaos while advancing their revolutionary goals. The destruction of legal records and government documents during the London Massacre represented another aspect of Tyler's systematic approach to social revolution. Court rolls, tax records, and manor documents were burned in massive bonfires that symbolically erased the written foundations of feudal oppression. This destruction of documentation would have long-lasting consequences for English legal and administrative systems. The rebels' treatment of captured clergy revealed their complex relationship with religious authority, as they distinguished between corrupt ecclesiastical officials who had oppressed the poor and ordinary priests who had served their communities faithfully. This discrimination demonstrated Tyler's political sophistication and his understanding of the need to maintain popular support. The coordination required to manage simultaneous attacks throughout London revealed the rebels' remarkable organizational capabilities, as Tyler's lieutenants successfully directed multiple execution squads while maintaining communication with the central command structure. This level of coordination required extensive prior planning and demonstrated the revolt's evolution from spontaneous uprising to disciplined military campaign. The psychological warfare employed during the London Massacre included the public display of severed heads, the forcing of victims to confess their crimes before execution, and the systematic humiliation of captured enemies. These tactics were designed to break the morale of remaining opposition while demonstrating rebel power to potential supporters. The three-day duration of the London Massacre allowed Tyler's forces to systematically work through their target lists while giving psychological pressure time to build among potential victims who remained in hiding. The prolonged nature of the killing demonstrated the rebels' commitment to complete elimination of their enemies, rather than merely symbolic victories. The international implications of the London Massacre became apparent as foreign governments recalled their ambassadors and merchants, recognizing that Tyler's revolt represented a threat to the entire European social order. The systematic killing of foreign residents sent a clear message that the rebels' revolutionary vision extended beyond English borders to encompass a rejection of international commerce and cultural exchange. The London bloodbath represented the high-water mark of the peasants' revolt, demonstrating both the awesome power of organized popular violence and the ultimate limitations of revolutionary terror. While Tyler's forces succeeded in eliminating hundreds of enemies and terrorizing the capital, their inability to create sustainable governing institutions would ultimately doom their revolutionary experiment to failure. The systematic nature of the peasants' revolt's campaign of murder becomes most apparent through examination of the comprehensive execution list compiled by rebel leaders throughout southeastern England. These documents, some of which survived in chronicles and legal records, reveal a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and a methodical approach to revolutionary violence that transformed spontaneous uprising into organized genocide. The creation of these lists began weeks before the revolt erupted into open violence, as secret networks of peasant organizers identified individuals whose elimination would serve their revolutionary objectives. The process was both democratic and deadly, with village assemblies contributing names, while rebel leaders coordinated the compilation of regional target lists that would guide execution squads throughout the uprising. Wat Tyler's master list, reconstructed from various contemporary sources, contained over 1,500 names representing every level of English society deemed hostile to peasant interests. The list was organized geographically and by priority, with the most important targets marked for immediate elimination, while lesser enemies were scheduled for later execution once primary objectives had been achieved. The criteria for inclusion on rebel death lists reveal the ideological sophistication of the revolt's leadership and their comprehensive vision for social transformation. Royal officials, tax collectors, and justices of the peace were obvious targets. But the lists also included merchants who had grown wealthy through exploitation of peasant labor, landlords who had enclosed common lands, and clergy who had supported secular authorities rather than ministering to the poor. The most disturbing aspect of the execution list was their inclusion of anyone associated with literacy or learning, reflecting Tyler's belief that education was itself a tool of oppression. Monks who could read and write, scribes who maintained legal records, and even children who showed signs of scholarly ability were marked for death as enemies of the common people. John Ball's theological contributions to target selection added a religious dimension to what might otherwise have been purely economic violence. His interpretation of Christian doctrine led to the inclusion of wealthy clergy, corrupt ecclesiastical officials, and anyone who had used religious authority to justify social inequality. Ball's influence transformed the execution list from simple hit lists into theological documents that sanctified murder as righteous work. The systematic inclusion of foreign residents on rebel death lists reflected the revolt's xenophobic character and Tyler's understanding of how ethnic hatred could unite his diverse followers. Flemish weavers, Italian bankers, French merchants, and German craftsmen were all marked for elimination regardless of their individual behavior or circumstances, their foreign birth making them inherently suspect in the rebels' worldview. The geographical distribution of names on the execution list reveals the extensive intelligence networks that supported the revolt's operations. Rebels in Essex compiled lists of targets in Kent, while Kentish insurgents identified enemies in Hertfordshire, demonstrating communication systems that spanned multiple counties and allowed coordinated attacks across wide areas. The social analysis underlying the execution list was remarkably sophisticated, reflecting an understanding of class dynamics that went beyond simple economic resentment. The rebels identified not only direct oppressors, but also the supporting structures that maintained feudal hierarchy, including lawyers who enforced unjust laws and merchants who profited from peasant exploitation. The inclusion of women on the execution list challenges traditional assumptions about medieval attitudes toward gender and violence. Wealthy widows who had inherited estates, noble ladies who had abused their servants, and even nuns who had accumulated personal property were marked for death alongside their male counterparts, demonstrating that the rebels' revolutionary vision transcended gender distinctions. The meticulous organization of the execution list by trade and profession reveals the rebels' systematic approach to social engineering through selective murder. Lawyers were grouped together for simultaneous elimination, while merchants were categorized by specialty to ensure that no aspect of commercial exploitation escaped revolutionary justice. The updating and revision of execution lists as the revolt progressed demonstrates the dynamic nature of rebel target selection and their responsiveness to changing circumstances. New names were added as previously unknown enemies were identified, while some targets were removed when they demonstrated support for rebel objectives or fled beyond the reach of execution squads. The distribution of execution lists to local rebel commanders required sophisticated communication networks and standardized formats that would allow efficient implementation across diverse geographical areas. The rebels developed coded symbols and abbreviations that could convey priority levels and execution methods while maintaining security against potential infiltration. The psychological impact of the execution lists extended far beyond their intended victims to terrorize entire communities that knew such documents existed. Rumors about list inclusion spread panic throughout southeastern England, causing many individuals to flee their homes and abandon their properties rather than risk revolutionary justice. The implementation of execution lists required careful coordination between intelligence gathering, target location, and elimination operations. Rebel scouts were responsible for confirming the presence of listed individuals, while specialized execution squads carried out the actual killings according to predetermined methods and schedules. The moral justification for the execution list was provided through elaborate ideological frameworks that transformed murder into righteous action. Rebel theologians like John Ball argued that eliminating oppressors was not only permissible, but mandatory for true Christians, while secular leaders framed the killings as necessary steps toward social justice and economic equality. The verification process for execution list targets involved multiple layers of confirmation to ensure that innocent individuals were not mistakenly killed. Witnesses were required to confirm the identity and crimes of intended victims, while rebel tribunals conducted brief hearings before carrying out death sentences. This pseudo-legal process provided legitimacy for what were essentially predetermined executions. The tactical considerations underlying list compilation reveal the rebels' sophisticated understanding of their enemy's defensive capabilities and likely responses. High-priority targets were often grouped geographically to allow rapid sequential elimination, while isolated individuals were scheduled for simultaneous attacks that would prevent warning networks from operating effectively. The inclusion of children on some execution lists represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the rebels' systematic approach to social transformation. Young people who showed signs of education or whose families had collaborated with oppressive authorities were marked for death as future enemies who might grow up to restore the old order if allowed to survive. The economic analysis embedded in the execution lists demonstrates the rebels' understanding that social revolution required the elimination of entire economic classes rather than just individual oppressors. Merchants, bankers, and skilled craftsmen were targeted not for personal crimes, but for their roles in maintaining economic systems that disadvantage peasants. The survival of fragmentary execution list copies in various archives provides historians with unprecedented insight into the planning and organization of medieval revolutionary violence. These documents reveal a level of systematic thinking about mass murder that challenges traditional assumptions about peasant capabilities and medieval political sophistication. The implementation challenges posed by extensive execution lists required innovative solutions from rebel leaders who lacked experience in managing large-scale killing operations. Time constraints, resource limitations, and security concerns all influenced how targets were prioritized and eliminated during the revolt's brief but intense period of revolutionary terror. The psychological profiles of individuals responsible for compiling execution lists reveal a combination of genuine grievance and calculating intelligence that enabled them to transform popular anger into systematic violence. These men possessed both the education necessary to organize complex operations and the moral flexibility required to plan mass murder. The regional variations in execution list criteria reflect local conditions and grievances while maintaining consistency with the revolt's overall ideological framework. Essex rebels focused heavily on tax collectors and royal officials, while Kentish insurgents emphasized foreign merchants and wealthy clergy, demonstrating how national revolutionary goals were adapted to local circumstances. The intelligence networks required to maintain accurate execution lists across multiple counties represented one of the revolt's most sophisticated organizational achievements. Rebel spies operated in markets, taverns, and manor houses throughout southeastern England, gathering information about potential targets while monitoring the movements of enemies who might escape revolutionary justice through flight or concealment. The coding systems used to protect execution list information from discovery by royal agents demonstrated remarkable sophistication for a peasant organization. Names were disguised through various cipher methods, while locations and timing were referenced through symbolic systems that would be meaningless to unauthorized observers, but could be decoded by rebel operatives familiar with the keys. The psychological impact of execution list rumors on targeted individuals was often as devastating as actual murder, as people who suspected they might be marked for death lived in constant terror while abandoning their normal activities and social relationships. This climate of fear served rebel interests by disrupting normal administrative and economic functions while demonstrating their power to terrorize enemies. The revision and updating of execution lists as circumstances changed demonstrated the dynamic nature of rebel target selection and their responsiveness to evolving political situations. Names were added as new enemies emerged, or existing targets revealed additional crimes against the people, while some individuals were removed when they demonstrated genuine conversion to rebel causes or proved useful for intelligence purposes. By mid-June 1381, the systematic murder campaigns launched by Wat Tyler's forces had transformed southeastern England into a landscape of terror where traditional authority had collapsed and revolutionary violence governed daily life. The rebels had moved beyond simple revenge killings to establish a comprehensive reign of terror designed to permanently destroy the existing social order through the systematic elimination of entire classes of people. The administrative structure developed to manage systematic killing operations rivaled that of royal government in its scope and efficiency. Tyler's lieutenants established regional commands responsible for coordinating murder campaigns across multiple counties, while specialized units were created to handle intelligence gathering, victim identification, execution operations, and evidence disposal. The bureaucracy of death that emerged from these organizational efforts demonstrated the rebels' sophisticated understanding of administrative requirements for managing large-scale violence. Written orders were issued for specific executions, reports were compiled on the progress of murder campaigns, and statistical records were maintained to track the elimination of various categories of enemies. Jack Straw's emergence as Tyler's chief lieutenant in charge of terror operations revealed the systematic nature of rebel leadership development and their recognition that different skills were required for different aspects of revolutionary warfare. While Tyler focused on military strategy and political objectives, Straw specialized in the practical aspects of organizing and executing systematic murder campaigns. The training programs established for execution squad members demonstrated the rebels' understanding that effective killing required both technical skills and psychological conditioning. New recruits were gradually introduced to violence through participation in crowd executions before being trusted with more independent assassination assignments that required greater personal initiative and emotional detachment. The standardization of execution methods across rebel territories served both practical and symbolic purposes, ensuring that murders could be carried out efficiently while creating a recognizable signature that would terrorize potential victims and inspire rebel supporters. The development of trademark killing techniques became an important aspect of psychological warfare. The territorial organization of murder campaigns followed clear geographical boundaries that corresponded to existing administrative divisions, allowing rebels to systematically work through target populations while maintaining coordination between different operational areas. Each region was assigned quotas for eliminations that reflected both target density and available manpower. The communication systems developed to coordinate systematic killing across wide geographical areas represented remarkable innovations in medieval organizational technology. A network of messengers, signal fires, and coded messages enabled rebel commanders to synchronize attacks and share intelligence about enemy movements and defensive preparations. The logistical challenges of managing systematic murder operations required innovative solutions for transporting personnel and equipment, maintaining weapons and supplies, and disposing of large quantities of evidence. The rebels developed supply chains and support systems that enabled sustained killing campaigns over extended periods. The recruitment strategies employed to build execution squads focused on identifying individuals who possessed both the physical capabilities and psychological characteristics necessary for systematic murder. Former soldiers, criminals, and social outcasts were particularly sought after for their experience with violence and their lack of strong moral inhibitions. The ideological indoctrination programs designed to prepare ordinary peasants for participation in systematic killing drew heavily on John Ball's theological teachings and secular arguments about social justice. These educational efforts were crucial for overcoming natural reluctance to commit murder and maintaining morale during extended campaigns of violence. The specialization within execution squads reflected the complex requirements of different types of killing operations. Some units focused on mass executions of captured enemies, while others specialized in targeted assassinations of specific individuals who had been identified through intelligence operations. The quality control measures implemented to ensure that executions were carried out according to rebel standards included supervision by experienced killers, post-execution reviews to identify procedural improvements, and disciplinary actions against squad members who failed to meet performance expectations. The psychological support systems developed for execution squad members recognized that even hardened killers could be affected by prolonged exposure to systematic violence. These programs included religious counseling, group discussions about the righteousness of their cause, and recreational activities designed to maintain unit cohesion and individual mental health. The intelligence operations supporting murder campaigns required extensive networks of informants and spies who could identify potential targets while monitoring the activities of enemies who might escape through flight or concealment. These intelligence systems represented some of the most sophisticated aspects of rebel organization. The counterintelligence measures implemented to protect execution operations from detection and disruption included security protocols for sensitive information, procedures for identifying and eliminating potential infiltrators, and contingency plans for responding to discovery by royal authorities. The propaganda efforts designed to justify and promote systematic killing campaigns utilized both written materials and oral communication to spread rebel ideology while intimidating potential opponents. These information operations were crucial for maintaining public support and preventing organized resistance to revolutionary violence. The economic aspects of systematic murder included not only the confiscation of victims' property, but also the disruption of commercial activities that depended on the targeted classes. The elimination of merchants, craftsmen, and administrators created economic chaos that served rebel interests by demonstrating the collapse of existing systems. The international implications of the systematic murder campaigns became apparent as news of the atrocities spread beyond England's borders, influencing foreign perceptions of the rebellion and affecting diplomatic relationships with other European powers. The systematic nature of the violence shocked even observers accustomed to medieval brutality. The legal frameworks developed by rebels to justify systematic killing included elaborate pseudo-judicial procedures that provided a veneer of legitimacy to predetermined executions. These kangaroo courts served propaganda purposes while helping participants rationalize their involvement in mass murder. The seasonal variations in murder campaign intensity reflected both practical considerations related to weather and agricultural cycles and strategic calculations about optimal timing for maximum psychological impact. Winter months were particularly favored for systematic killing because harsh conditions made resistance more difficult. The urban versus rural differences in systematic killing operations reflected the varying challenges posed by different environments and population densities. City campaigns required different tactics and security measures than rural operations, leading to the development of specialized approaches for different types of terrain. The response of royal authorities to the systematic murder campaigns terrorizing southeastern England was initially hampered by the speed and coordination of rebel attacks, the collapse of normal administrative systems, and the flight or elimination of key officials who might have organized effective resistance. However, by late June 1381, King Richard II and his advisors had begun to develop strategies for confronting the revolutionary terror that threatened to destroy the kingdom. The young king's personal courage and political instincts proved crucial in developing responses to the unprecedented challenges posed by systematic rebel violence. Despite being only 14 years old, Richard demonstrated remarkable composure and strategic thinking as he grappled with a crisis that had overwhelmed his older and more experienced advisors. The decision to meet directly with rebel leaders represented a calculated risk that reflected both the desperate nature of the royal position and Richard's understanding that conventional military responses had proven inadequate against the sophisticated organization of Tyler's forces. The king's willingness to personally confront the rebellion's leadership would prove to be the key to breaking the cycle of revolutionary violence. The intelligence-gathering operations launched by royal agents to understand rebel organization and capabilities revealed the sophisticated nature of the enemy they faced. Reports from survivors and infiltrators painted a picture of systematic violence that was far more organized and ideologically coherent than traditional peasant uprisings. The military preparations undertaken by royal forces were complicated by the need to distinguish between rebel combatants and ordinary peasants who might have been coerced into participation. The systematic nature of rebel violence made it difficult to identify appropriate targets for military retaliation without risking the massacre of innocent civilians. The diplomatic efforts to isolate rebel leadership and break apart their coalition involved secret negotiations with moderate elements within the rebel movement who might be persuaded to abandon violence in exchange for political concessions. These initiatives revealed divisions within rebel ranks that could be exploited by skilled royal diplomacy. The propaganda campaigns launched to counter rebel ideology and restore confidence in royal authority required careful attention to messaging that could appeal to peasant grievances while undermining support for systematic violence. Royal proclamations emphasized themes of justice, mercy, and legitimate reform while condemning revolutionary extremism. The legal strategies developed to prosecute captured rebels were complicated by the unprecedented nature of their crimes and the need to balance justice with political reconciliation. Royal legal advisors struggled to develop appropriate penalties for systematic murder while avoiding actions that might further inflame popular unrest. The financial measures implemented to support royal resistance efforts included special taxes, loans from wealthy supporters, and the confiscation of rebel property. These economic policies were designed to fund military operations while demonstrating royal authority through the exercise of traditional fiscal powers. The alliance-building efforts undertaken to strengthen royal forces involved negotiations with noble families, urban authorities, and foreign powers who might provide military assistance against the rebellion. These diplomatic initiatives were crucial for assembling sufficient forces to confront the well-organized rebel armies. The strategic planning for the confrontation with rebel forces required careful analysis of enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities, while taking into account the limited resources available to royal commanders. The systematic nature of rebel violence demanded equally systematic responses that could exploit weaknesses in their organization. The psychological warfare operations designed to undermine rebel morale included spreading rumors about divisions within their leadership, highlighting the futility of their cause, and emphasizing the inevitable consequences of continued resistance to royal authority. These information campaigns were crucial for breaking the psychological dominance that rebels had established through systematic terror. The security measures implemented to protect remaining royal officials and supporters included the establishment of fortified positions, the organization of protective details, and the development of communication systems that could operate despite rebel interdiction efforts. These defensive preparations were essential for maintaining the nucleus of royal authority. The coordination with church authorities to mobilize religious opposition to rebel violence proved crucial for undermining the theological justifications that had enabled systematic murder. Ecclesiastical denunciations of revolutionary killing helped counter the radical religious teachings of John Ball and his followers. The intelligence operations designed to penetrate rebel organizations and gather information about their plans required the recruitment of agents who could gain access to enemy leadership while avoiding detection. These espionage efforts provided crucial insights into rebel capabilities and intentions. The timing of royal counteroffensives was carefully planned to coincide with moments of rebel vulnerability while maximizing the psychological impact of royal resurgence. The coordination of multiple simultaneous operations was designed to overwhelm rebel command and control systems. The negotiation strategies developed for potential talks with rebel leaders included careful consideration of what concessions might be offered to end the violence while maintaining essential royal prerogatives. These diplomatic preparations reflected understanding that military victory alone might not be sufficient to restore lasting peace. The Smithfield confrontation on June 15, 1381, represented the culmination of weeks of careful planning and preparation by royal strategists who understood that a decisive confrontation with rebel leadership offered the best hope for ending the systematic violence that had terrorized the kingdom. The meeting was carefully orchestrated to maximize royal advantages while exploiting known weaknesses in rebel organization. The selection of Smithfield as the meeting location reflected strategic considerations about terrain, accessibility, and symbolic significance that could influence the outcome of negotiations. Royal advisors understood that the physical setting of the confrontation would affect both participant behavior and public perceptions of the results. The security arrangements for the royal party included both visible and concealed protective measures designed to ensure the king's safety while maintaining the appearance of confidence and good faith in negotiations. The balance between protection and diplomatic credibility required careful planning and skilled execution. The negotiation tactics employed by royal representatives were designed to probe rebel intentions while identifying potential weaknesses that could be exploited if talks failed. The systematic approach to diplomatic engagement reflected the careful preparation that had characterized royal responses to the rebellion. The dramatic confrontation at Smithfield on June 15, 1381, between King Richard II and Wat Tyler would prove to be the turning point that ended the systematic reign of terror that had convulsed southeastern England for nearly 2 months. The events of that day demonstrated how quickly even the most sophisticated revolutionary organization could collapse when its leadership structure was disrupted and its psychological dominance was broken. The meeting began with Tyler displaying the arrogant confidence that had characterized rebel leadership throughout their campaign of systematic violence. Arriving with only a small escort, he treated the encounter more as a negotiation between equals than as a subject's petition to their rightful king. His behavior reflected the psychological transformation that months of successful terrorism had wrought in rebel leadership. Tyler's demands during the initial negotiations revealed the revolutionary scope of his vision and the impossibility of any compromise that might have preserved the existing social order. His insistence on the complete abolition of serfdom, the elimination of all lordship except the king's, and the redistribution of church property represented a program that would have fundamentally transformed English society. The breakdown of negotiations came when Tyler's personal conduct became so insulting that royal patience was finally exhausted. His aggressive gestures, contemptuous language, and physical threats toward the king created a situation that could only be resolved through violence. The tension that had been building throughout the confrontation reached a breaking point when Tyler's arrogance finally provoked retaliation. The killing of Tyler was accomplished through a coordinated attack by multiple royal supporters who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike. William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, delivered the first blow with a dagger, while other courtiers quickly finished the rebel leader with swords and clubs. The attack was swift and decisive, leaving no opportunity for Tyler's guards to intervene effectively. The immediate aftermath of Tyler's death created chaos among the assembled rebel forces who had expected to witness their leader's diplomatic triumph. The sight of their seemingly invincible commander lying dead in the dust shattered the aura of revolutionary invincibility that had sustained rebel morale throughout their campaign of systematic murder. King Richard's immediate response to the crisis demonstrated remarkable courage and political instinct as he rode directly toward the now leaderless rebel army and declared himself their new captain. His promise to be their leader and his offers of reform and pardon prevented the mass violence that might have erupted following Tyler's assassination. The psychological impact of Tyler's death extended far beyond the immediate scene at Smithfield to affect rebel operations throughout southeastern England. News of their supreme leader's death spread rapidly through the communication networks that had previously coordinated systematic violence, now carrying word of disaster rather than triumph. The collapse of rebel command structure following Tyler's death exposed the fundamental weakness of their organizational system, which had depended heavily on personal leadership rather than institutional structures capable of surviving the loss of key individuals. Local commanders found themselves isolated and without clear direction for continuing their operations. The royal exploitation of this leadership vacuum was swift and systematic, as government forces launched coordinated operations to eliminate remaining rebel commanders before they could reorganize their forces or develop new leadership structures. The speed of royal response demonstrated the effectiveness of the preparations that had been made for this moment. Jack Straw's capture within days of Tyler's death eliminated the rebels' most effective operational commander and the architect of their systematic murder campaigns. His subsequent interrogation and execution provided royal authorities with detailed intelligence about rebel organization while sending a clear message about the fate awaiting other revolutionary leaders. John Ball's arrest and execution represented the destruction of the rebellion's ideological foundation, as his theological justifications for revolutionary violence had provided crucial moral support for participants who might otherwise have been restrained by Christian conscience. His death removed the intellectual framework that had sustained systematic murder campaigns. The systematic hunt for rebel leaders throughout southeastern England was characterized by the same organizational efficiency that had marked their own terror campaigns. Royal forces used captured documents, coerced testimony, and intelligence networks to identify and eliminate the command structure that had directed months of systematic violence. The mass surrenders that followed the collapse of rebel leadership revealed how much of their apparent popular support had been based on fear and intimidation rather than genuine ideological commitment. Peasants who had enthusiastically participated in murder campaigns suddenly claimed to have been coerced victims seeking only to protect their families. The judicial proceedings that followed the rebellion's collapse were marked by systematic brutality that matched and often exceeded the violence employed by the rebels themselves. Royal justices showed no mercy to captured insurgents, imposing death sentences on hundreds of participants while using torture to extract confessions and identify additional conspirators. The regional variations in royal suppression reflected both local circumstances and the personal vendettas of surviving royal officials who had been targeted for assassination during the rebellion. Areas that had experienced the worst atrocities suffered the harshest retribution. while regions with less systematic violence were treated with comparative moderation. The destruction of rebel intelligence networks was accomplished through systematic interrogation of captured operatives and the seizure of documentary evidence that revealed the scope and sophistication of revolutionary organization. The collapse of these information systems left surviving rebels blind and isolated from potential supporters. The restoration of royal authority was facilitated by the return of officials and nobles who had fled during the height of rebel terror. Their reappearance in positions of power demonstrated the resilience of traditional structures and their ability to survive even sophisticated revolutionary challenges. The economic consequences of the rebellion's collapse were severe and long-lasting, as the systematic destruction of property and elimination of skilled personnel created disruptions that affected English society for years. The cost of suppressing the revolt and rebuilding damaged institutions placed additional burdens on a kingdom already strained by warfare and taxation. The international implications of the rebellion's defeat were significant, as European observers drew lessons about the effectiveness of royal authority and the ultimate futility of revolutionary violence. The English experience became a cautionary tale that influenced responses to subsequent uprisings throughout the continent. The documentation of rebel crimes during the suppression trials provided comprehensive evidence of the systematic nature of their violence while revealing organizational capabilities that had previously been underestimated. These records became crucial sources for understanding both revolutionary methods and the responses they provoked from established authority. The psychological trauma inflicted on English society by months of systematic violence created lasting changes in attitudes toward social change and popular participation in politics. The knowledge that peasant uprisings could organize sophisticated murder campaigns made both nobles and commoners more conservative in their approach to political reform. The pardons eventually granted to many rebel participants reflected royal recognition that social reconciliation required balancing justice with mercy. However, the selective nature of these pardons ensured that those most responsible for systematic violence faced the full consequences of their actions. The institutional reforms implemented in response to the rebellion were designed to address some of the legitimate grievances that had motivated popular unrest while strengthening defenses against future revolutionary violence. These changes reflected understanding that prevention was preferable to suppression in dealing with social tensions. The suppression of the peasants' revolt in the summer of 1381 brought an end to the most systematic campaign of revolutionary murder in medieval English history. But the legacy of those blood-soaked months would influence English society, politics, and culture for centuries to come. The revolt had demonstrated both the terrifying potential of organized popular violence and the ultimate futility of attempting to build a just society through the systematic elimination of one's enemies. The immediate casualties of the revolt and its suppression were staggering by medieval standards. Conservative estimates suggest that the rebels murdered over 400 people during their campaign of systematic terror, while royal forces executed at least 1,500 insurgents during the brutal suppression that followed Tyler's death. Thousands more fled the country or lived in constant fear of retribution, creating demographic disruptions that affected entire regions. The social transformations that had motivated the rebellion were ultimately achieved through gradual economic evolution rather than revolutionary violence. The labor shortages created by the Black Death proved more powerful than feudal law in forcing changes to the relationship between lords and peasants. Serfdom gradually disappeared, wages slowly rose, and social mobility increased. But these changes occurred over decades rather than through the immediate revolution that had justified systematic murder. The psychological impact of the revolt's campaign of systematic killing created lasting trauma that affected relationships between social classes throughout English society. The knowledge that peasants could organize sophisticated murder operations made nobles perpetually suspicious of their social inferiors, while the memory of royal suppression reminded common people of the dangers of challenging established authority too directly. The institutional changes implemented in response to the rebellion included both repressive measures designed to prevent future uprisings and reforms intended to address legitimate grievances that had contributed to popular unrest. The Statute of Cambridge in 1388 established new procedures for dealing with laborers, while various legal reforms attempted to provide more equitable treatment for the common people. The technological and organizational innovations developed during the revolt influenced subsequent uprisings throughout Europe, as future revolutionaries studied the methods employed by Tyler and his associates while learning from their ultimate failure. The systematic approach to target identification, execution squad organization, and psychological warfare became templates for later revolutionary movements. The religious controversies sparked by the revolt's theological justifications for systematic murder contributed to broader debates about the relationship between Christian doctrine and social justice. John Ball's arguments about divine sanction for revolutionary violence would be echoed by later religious reformers who sought to justify resistance to established authority, ultimately contributing to the intellectual foundations of the Protestant Reformation. The economic disruptions caused by the systematic elimination of educated and skilled individuals created long-lasting problems that affected English development for decades. The loss of merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and administrators disrupted commercial networks and legal systems in ways that proved difficult to repair quickly, demonstrating the practical limitations of social revolution through selective killing. The international reputation that England acquired as a result of the revolt's systematic violence influenced diplomatic relationships and commercial connections throughout Europe. Foreign governments became more cautious about their interactions with English authorities, while merchants and investors showed reluctance to establish operations in a country where revolutionary terror had demonstrated such sophisticated organization. The legal precedents established during the revolt's suppression contributed to the development of more systematic approaches to dealing with internal threats and revolutionary conspiracies. The extensive use of torture, forced confessions, and collective punishment became standard tools for dealing with political dissent, creating precedents that would influence English justice for centuries. The cultural impact of the revolt extended beyond immediate political consequences to influence literature, folklore, and popular memory in ways that would shape English attitudes towards social change for generations. The systematic violence employed by both rebels and royal forces became part of national mythology that warned against the dangers of extremism while celebrating the importance of order and stability. The military lessons learned from the revolt influenced the development of English approaches to internal security and crowd control. Royal authorities recognized the need for more sophisticated methods of intelligence gathering and rapid response to organized threats, leading to the creation of new institutions and procedures that would serve as models for other European powers. The educational disruptions caused by the rebels' systematic targeting of literate individuals created gaps in cultural transmission that affected intellectual development in southeastern England for decades. The elimination of teachers, scribes, and educated clergy disrupted the normal processes by which knowledge and skills were passed from one generation to the next. The demographic changes resulting from the revolt's systematic killing campaigns had long-lasting effects on regional population structures and social organization. Some areas lost significant portions of their educated and propertied classes, creating opportunities for social mobility among survivors while also disrupting traditional community structures and economic relationships. The documentation of the revolt's systematic violence provided historians with unprecedented insights into the organization and methods of medieval revolutionary terror. The detailed records of target lists, execution procedures, and organizational structures became crucial sources for understanding both the potential and the limitations of popular violence in medieval society. The ultimate historical significance of the Peasants' Revolt lies not in its immediate failure, but in its demonstration that medieval society contained the potential for systematic revolutionary violence organized around coherent ideological programs. The revolt showed that popular movements could develop sophisticated organizational structures capable of coordinating complex operations across wide geographical areas. The memory of the revolt's systematic murder campaigns served as both warning and inspiration for future generations, demonstrating the potential consequences of social breakdown while also revealing the power that organized popular movements could wield against established authority. The events of 1381 became a permanent part of English political consciousness, influencing debates about social change and popular participation in government. The failure of revolutionary terror to achieve lasting social transformation during the Peasants' Revolt provided important lessons about the limitations of violence as a tool for political change. The systematic killing that had seemed so powerful during the revolt's early phases ultimately proved counterproductive, alienating potential supporters and justifying harsh suppression that eliminated any possibility of gradual reform. The moral legacy of the revolt remains complex and troubling, as it demonstrated both the capacity for ordinary people to commit systematic evil when provided with ideological justification and organizational structure, and the ability of societies to recognize such evil and mobilize resistance against it. The revolt serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of moral constraints in political action. The tragic irony of the Peasants' Revolt was that its campaign of systematic murder, undertaken in the name of social justice and human equality, ultimately demonstrated the futility of attempting to build a better world through the systematic elimination of one's enemies. The blood spilled in the fields and towns of medieval England served as a permanent reminder that the means employed to achieve political objectives inevitably shape the character of any society that emerges from revolutionary struggle. The 1,600 victims of the revolt's violence, both rebels and their targets, remain the true focus of historical memory, representing not only individual tragedies, but also broader failures of social protection and institutional responsibility. Their deaths served a purpose their killers never intended: the demonstration of evil's ultimate self-defeat and the implementation of reforms that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. The revolt's legacy continues to influence contemporary understanding of the relationship between social change and political violence, providing a case study in the potential and limitations of revolutionary terror that remains relevant to modern debates about justice, equality, and the proper methods for achieving social transformation. The systematic murders of 1381 stand as testament to both the power of organized popular movements and the ultimate futility of building lasting change on foundations of systematic violence. In the end, the Peasants' Revolt teaches us that while the desire for justice and equality represents noble human aspirations, the methods chosen to achieve these goals ultimately determine whether they result in genuine progress or merely substitute one form of oppression for another. The systematic murders committed in the name of the common people serve as eternal testimony to the importance of moral constraint in political action and the ultimate futility of attempting to create a just society through unjust means. The blood that soaked the fields of medieval England in 1381 stands as permanent witness to both humanity's capacity for evil and its ability to recognize and overcome that evil through courage, wisdom, and commitment to justice tempered by mercy. The harvest of that blood was not the revolutionary transformation sought by the rebels, but rather a deeper understanding of the moral foundations necessary for any lasting social progress. Story 2, The Bloody Benders, Terror on the Prairie. In the vast expanse of the Kansas prairie, where the horizon stretched endlessly under an enormous sky, a small inn stood as a beacon of hospitality for weary travelers making their way across the frontier. To passing strangers, the modest structure appeared to offer nothing more threatening than a hot meal and a place to rest for the night. They could not have known that they were approaching one of America's most notorious murder factories, operated by a family whose name would become synonymous with frontier evil. The year was 1871, and the American frontier was still a place where law was scarce, neighbors were few, and a man could disappear without anyone asking questions for months or even years. It was into this lawless landscape that the Bender family had arrived, carrying with them a darkness that would transform their humble inn into a charnel house where at least 11 innocent travelers would meet their deaths. The Benders were not ordinary frontier criminals driven by desperation or circumstance. They were systematic killers who had perfected their methods through careful planning and ruthless execution. Their operation combined the facade of frontier hospitality with the efficiency of an abattoir, creating a murder machine that could process victims with assembly line precision while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate business. John Bender Sr., the patriarch of this murderous clan, presented himself as a hardworking German immigrant seeking to build a new life on the American frontier. His wife, known only as Ma Bender, played the role of a frontier matron managing the domestic affairs of their roadside inn. Their son John Jr. and daughter Kate completed the family unit, each playing crucial roles in what would become one of the most systematic murder operations in American criminal history. The Benders had chosen their location with the calculating precision of professional killers. Their inn sat along the Osage Trail in southeastern Kansas, a route heavily traveled by settlers, merchants, and cattlemen moving between Kansas and the Indian Territory. The isolation of their establishment ensured privacy for their crimes, while its strategic location guaranteed a steady stream of potential victims. What made the Bender murders particularly chilling was not just their systematic nature, but the way the family had transformed the basic elements of frontier hospitality into instruments of death. A welcoming smile became a predator's lure, a comfortable chair became an execution device, and a family dinner table became the last thing many travelers would ever see. This is the story of how an ordinary-seeming family created an extraordinary killing machine in the heart of America's frontier, demonstrating that the most dangerous monsters are often those who hide behind masks of respectability and kindness. The Bloody Benders would prove that evil could flourish anywhere, even in the supposedly pure air of the American prairie, when the right combination of isolation, opportunity, and moral corruption came together in one terrible place. The Bender family's arrival in Labette County, Kansas, in early 1871 attracted little attention from their scattered neighbors. Like thousands of other immigrants, they appeared to be seeking opportunity on the frontier where land was cheap and federal oversight was minimal. Their decision to establish a roadside inn seemed perfectly reasonable given their location on the well-traveled Osage Trail, and their initial interactions with local residents gave no hint of the horrors to come. John Bender Sr., the family patriarch, was a man of about 60 who claimed to be a German immigrant, though his accent and mannerisms suggested a more complex background. He presented himself as a hardworking settler who understood the value of providing services to fellow travelers. But those who knew him well noticed an underlying coldness and calculating intelligence that seemed at odds with his humble farmer facade. The elder Bender's physical appearance was unremarkable by frontier standards: average height, weathered features, and the calloused hands of a man accustomed to manual labor. However, contemporary accounts suggest that his eyes held a predatory intensity that made some visitors uncomfortable, though few could articulate exactly what disturbed them about his gaze. Ma Bender, whose given name was never definitively established, was equally mysterious in her origins and background. She claimed to be John Sr.'s wife, though some observers suspected they were not legally married and might not even be related despite sharing a surname. Her appearance was described as masculine and intimidating, with a harsh voice and aggressive manner that contrasted sharply with traditional frontier femininity. The relationship between the elder Benders was characterized by a partnership of convenience rather than affection, as both seemed focused primarily on the practical aspects of their criminal enterprise. Their interactions suggested long familiarity with each other's methods and capabilities, indicating either a genuine marriage or a criminal association of significant duration. John Bender Jr., the supposed son of the elder pair, was a young man in his 20s whose sullen demeanor and limited English vocabulary made him an object of suspicion among neighbors who attempted friendly conversation. His primary role in the family operation appeared to be providing muscle for the physical aspects of their crimes, though he also served as a lookout and general laborer around the inn. The younger John's mental capacity was questioned by several contemporary observers who noted his apparent difficulty understanding complex instructions and his tendency to respond to questions with blank stares or inappropriate laughter. Whether this was genuine intellectual limitation or a carefully constructed facade designed to deflect suspicion remains unclear. Kate Bender, the family's daughter and star attraction, was perhaps the most dangerous member of the clan precisely because she appeared the most harmless. In her mid-20s, she possessed an attractive appearance and charming manner that contrasted sharply with the rough demeanor of her relatives. Her ability to put travelers at ease made her the perfect lure for drawing victims into the family's web. Kate's education and sophistication seemed markedly superior to that of her supposed relatives, leading some modern researchers to question whether she was actually related to the others or simply a partner in their criminal enterprise. Her fluent English, knowledge of current events, and familiarity with spiritualist practices suggested a background far different from that of a typical frontier family. The inn itself was a modest structure that reflected both the family's limited resources and their practical needs as systematic killers. The building consisted of a main room that served as dining area and general store, a small kitchen area, and a back room that served as private quarters for the family. The layout would prove ideally suited for their murderous purposes. The most distinctive feature of the inn's interior was the wagon canvas that divided the main room, creating separate seating areas that could provide privacy for different groups of travelers. This innocent-seeming arrangement would become crucial to the Bender's murder method, as it allowed them to isolate victims from potential witnesses while maintaining the appearance of normal hospitality. The inn's location was perfect for the Bender's purposes, situated far enough from other settlements to ensure privacy while remaining accessible to the steady stream of travelers who use the Osage Trail. The isolation that made the location ideal for crime also made it attractive to legitimate travelers seeking a safe place to rest during long journeys across the prairie. The family's business model appeared straightforward and legitimate. They provided meals, lodging, and basic supplies to travelers in exchange for cash payment. Their prices were reasonable by frontier standards, and their willingness to accept various forms of payment made them accessible to different types of customers. This legitimate business provided perfect cover for their criminal activities. The Benders' customer base included a diverse mix of frontier travelers, settlers moving west with their families, merchants transporting goods between settlements, cattlemen driving herds to market, and individual travelers pursuing various business or personal objectives. This diversity ensured a steady supply of potential victims, while making it difficult for authorities to identify patterns in disappearances. The family's method of victim selection was opportunistic rather than systematic, as they targeted travelers based on apparent wealth, lack of traveling companions, and uncertainty about their destinations or expected arrival times. Solo travelers carrying obvious valuables were particularly attractive targets, as their disappearances were less likely to prompt immediate investigation. The psychological dynamics within the Bender family were complex and remain largely mysterious due to the secretive nature of their operation and their eventual flight from justice. However, available evidence suggests a hierarchy with John Sr. serving as the overall leader, Mob Bender managing domestic operations, Kate handling customer relations, and John Jr. providing muscle for the actual murders. The family's daily routine revolved around their dual roles as innkeepers and murderers, requiring careful coordination to maintain their legitimate business while identifying and eliminating profitable targets. This balancing act demanded considerable organizational skill and emotional control from all family members, as they had to appear normal and welcoming while planning systematic murder. The establishment of the Bender Inn marked the beginning of what would become one of the most notorious criminal enterprises in American frontier history. The family had created what amounted to a murder factory disguised as a legitimate business, demonstrating a level of criminal sophistication that challenged contemporary assumptions about frontier lawlessness and the nature of organized crime in 19th century America. Kate Bender's public persona as a spiritualist medium and healer provided both the perfect cover for the family's criminal activities and a means of identifying wealthy targets who might be carrying significant sums of money. Her advertisements in local newspapers, proclaiming her abilities to contact the dead and heal the sick, drew visitors from across the region and established her reputation as a legitimate, if exotic, frontier businesswoman. The spiritualist movement that Kate exploited had gained enormous popularity in 19th century America, particularly following the devastation of the Civil War, when countless families sought to communicate with deceased loved ones. The frontier's isolation and harsh conditions created additional demand for spiritual comfort and supernatural explanations for life's uncertainties, making Kate's services particularly appealing to vulnerable travelers. Kate's spiritualist practices were sophisticated enough to convince even skeptical visitors of her apparent abilities. She conducted seances using standard techniques of the era, including table tapping, voice throwing, and the manipulation of objects in darkened rooms. Her knowledge of these methods suggested either genuine training in spiritualist practices or extensive self-education in the arts of deception. The young woman's physical appearance and personal magnetism were crucial elements in her success as both spiritualist and killer. Contemporary accounts describe her as attractive and well-dressed by frontier standards, with an engaging personality that could put strangers at ease while simultaneously extracting information about their backgrounds, destinations, and financial circumstances. Kate's educational background remained mysterious, but her vocabulary, knowledge of current events, and familiarity with spiritualist literature suggested an education far superior to that typically available to frontier women. Her ability to discuss complex theological and philosophical concepts made her particularly appealing to educated travelers who might otherwise have been suspicious of frontier spiritualists. The business aspects of Kate's spiritualist practice were managed with professional efficiency that reflected careful planning and sophisticated understanding of her target market. She charged substantial fees for her services, accepted various forms of payment, and maintained appointment schedules that allowed her to coordinate her legitimate practice with the family's criminal activities. Kate's client base included both local residents seeking spiritual guidance and travelers who had heard of her reputation through newspaper advertisements or word-of-mouth recommendations. This mix of customers provided excellent cover for the family's selection of murder victims while generating legitimate income that helped support their operations. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by Kate in her spiritualist practice proved equally effective for identifying and luring murder victims. Her ability to gain people's trust and extract personal information made her an ideal intelligence gatherer for the family's criminal enterprise, as she could assess potential targets' wealth and traveling circumstances without arousing suspicion. Kate's seances often took place in the back room of the inn, where she could control lighting and sound effects while maintaining privacy from other customers. This same room would later be used for disposing of victims' bodies, creating a macabre connection between her spiritual practices and the family's murderous activities. The religious and philosophical framework that Kate used to justify her spiritualist practices may have also served to rationalize the family's criminal activities. Her familiarity with concepts of life after death, spiritual communication, and supernatural intervention could have provided psychological justification for murder by framing victims' deaths as spiritually predetermined or necessary. Kate's advertisements in regional newspapers served multiple purposes beyond simply attracting spiritualist clients. They established her public presence as a legitimate businesswoman, provided alibis for suspicious activities at the inn, and created a paper trail that suggested normal commercial operations rather than criminal enterprise. The seasonal variations in Kate's spiritualist practice reflected both the agricultural cycles of frontier life and the patterns of travel on the Osage Trail. Winter months brought fewer travelers, but more local clients seeking spiritual comfort during harsh weather, while spring and summer attracted numerous travelers who could serve as potential murder victims. Kate's interactions with local law enforcement and government officials were carefully managed to maintain her respectable reputation while gathering intelligence about official interest in missing persons or suspicious activities. Her status as a locally known businesswoman provided protection from casual investigation and access to information about law enforcement activities. The spiritualist community's networks provided Kate with connections throughout the region that could be used for both legitimate business purposes and criminal intelligence gathering. Her correspondence with other spiritualists and participation in regional meetings allowed her to monitor law enforcement activities and identify potential threats to the family's operations. Kate's personal relationships with local residents were characterized by calculated friendliness, designed to maintain her respectable facade while gathering useful information about community activities and concerns. Her ability to appear genuinely interested in others' welfare made her an effective intelligence gatherer and helped deflect suspicion from the family's activities. The equipment and props used in Kate's spiritualist practice included items that could double as murder weapons or tools for disposing of bodies. Her collection of knives, hammers, and other implements could be explained as necessary for her healing practices while serving more sinister purposes when required. Kate's knowledge of anatomy and physiology, acquired through her healing practices, proved useful for the family's murder operations by enabling more efficient killing methods and better understanding of how to dispose of bodies without leaving obvious evidence. Her medical knowledge made her a valuable technical advisor for the family's criminal activities. The psychological toll of maintaining dual identities as both healer and killer appears to have affected Kate differently than her supposed relatives. As contemporary accounts suggest, she showed signs of genuine emotional strain during the later phases of the family's criminal career. Her ability to compartmentalize her activities became increasingly difficult as the number of victims mounted. Kate's spiritualist persona would ultimately prove to be both the family's greatest asset and their most significant vulnerability, as her public profile made her easily identifiable to law enforcement, while her practices attracted the attention of investigators seeking to understand the disappearances of travelers who had visited the Bender Inn seeking spiritual guidance. The Bender family's method of killing was a masterpiece of frontier efficiency, combining elements of surprise, brutality, and systematic disposal that allowed them to murder at least 11 people over approximately 2 years without detection. Their technique was refined through practice and adapted to the specific constraints of their location and customer base, creating a murder machine that operated with deadly precision. The physical layout of the Bender Inn was perfectly designed for their murderous purposes, whether by accident or deliberate planning. The main room's division by a wagon canvas created separate seating areas that allowed the family to isolate victims from potential witnesses while maintaining the appearance of normal hospitality. This arrangement would prove crucial to their success as systematic killers. The family's preferred murder method involved seating lone travelers at a specific table positioned against the canvas divider, with the victims back to the fabric partition. This placement was presented as offering the best view out the window or the most comfortable seating, making it seem like special hospitality rather than a carefully planned execution setup. Once the victim was seated in the designated position, one of the male family members would position himself behind the canvas partition, directly behind the unsuspecting traveler. The killer would then wait for the optimal moment to strike, usually when the victim was distracted by conversation or focused on eating a meal provided by Kate or Ma Bender. The actual killing blow was delivered with a hammer or similar blunt instrument, striking the victim's skull with sufficient force to cause immediate unconsciousness or death. The canvas partition muffled the sound of the blow while concealing the killer from view, allowing the murder to be committed in near silence, even when other customers were present in the main room. The choice of weapon reflected both practical considerations and the family's preference for quick, silent killing. Hammers were common tools on any frontier establishment, making their presence unremarkable to visitors, while their effectiveness as weapons ensured that victims could be disabled with a single blow, minimizing noise and struggle that might alert other customers. The timing of murders was carefully planned to coincide with periods when the inn had few or no other customers, reducing the risk of witnesses while ensuring privacy for the disposal process. The family became expert at managing customer traffic to create opportunities for killing while maintaining their legitimate business operations. After the initial blow rendered victims unconscious or dead, the family would immediately drag them through a trapdoor into the cellar beneath the inn, where the killing could be completed if necessary, and the body prepared for disposal. This underground chamber served as both execution room and temporary morgue, allowing the family to complete their work without fear of discovery. The cellar's construction suggests premeditation in the murder scheme, as it was unusually deep for a frontier root cellar and equipped with features that facilitated body disposal. The excavation required to create this space would have been significant work, indicating long-term planning rather than opportunistic crime. The family's method of ensuring victim death involved cutting throats with knives, a technique that guaranteed death while allowing them to collect blood in containers for disposal. This systematic approach to killing demonstrated their evolution from amateur murderers to efficient killers who had refined their methods through practice and experience. The disposal of bodies required careful planning and considerable physical effort, as the family had to transport corpses from the cellar to burial sites without detection by neighbors or passing travelers. They developed techniques for moving bodies during nighttime hours when observation was unlikely, using the inn's location and their knowledge of local terrain to their advantage. The burial sites chosen by the Benders were strategically located to minimize the risk of discovery while providing easy access for disposal activities. Bodies were typically buried in the inn's orchard, where the disturbed soil would be less noticeable and the grave sites could be disguised as normal agricultural activity. The family's approach to victim selection was opportunistic, but followed clear criteria that maximized profit while minimizing risk. They preferred lone travelers who appeared wealthy, carried obvious valuables, and had uncertain travel plans that would delay discovery of their disappearances. Groups of travelers were generally avoided due to the increased risk of resistance and witnesses. The psychological aspects of the family's murder method reveal their systematic approach to killing and their ability to overcome normal human inhibitions against violence. Each family member had specific roles in the murder process, creating a division of labor that may have helped them psychologically distance themselves from the full horror of their crimes. Kate's role in the murder process typically involved engaging victims in conversation to keep them distracted while the killer positioned himself for the fatal blow. Her spiritualist practices provided excellent cover for unusual behavior or requests, as she could claim supernatural guidance required specific seating arrangements or activities. May Bender's responsibilities usually included food preparation and general hospitality that would put victims at ease while ensuring they were properly positioned for killing. Her domestic role provided natural access to victims and explanations for her presence throughout the murder process. John Jr.'s function as the primary killer required him to overcome significant psychological barriers while developing the physical skills necessary for efficient murder. His apparent mental limitations may have made this psychological adaptation easier, as he could follow instructions without fully comprehending their moral implications. John Sr.'s role as overall coordinator required him to manage the complex logistics of running a murder operation while maintaining a legitimate business. His responsibilities included victim selection, timing of murders, body disposal, and the destruction of evidence that might link the family to their crimes. The family's ability to maintain their murder operations for approximately 2 years without detection demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of frontier law enforcement limitations and their skill at exploiting the social conditions that made systematic killing possible in isolated areas. The evolution of their murder method over time shows increasing efficiency and confidence as they gained experience with killing and body disposal. Early murders may have been crude and risky, but later victims were killed with professional precision that reflected the family's deadly education in the arts of murder. The physical evidence of the family's crimes would eventually provide law enforcement with crucial proof of their activities, as the discovery of bodies and murder weapons would confirm suspicions about the inn's role in traveler disappearances. However, by the time this evidence was uncovered, the Benders had already fled, leaving behind only the gruesome remains of their frontier murder machine. The victims of the Bender family's systematic murder campaign represented a cross-section of frontier society, united only by their tragic decision to seek hospitality at the wrong inn during their travels across the Kansas prairie. Each person who died at the hands of the bloody Benders had their own story, their own dreams, and their own reasons for making the journey that would ultimately cost them their lives. Dr. William York stands out among the Bender victims not only because of his prominence in the community, but also because his disappearance would ultimately lead to the family's downfall. A well-respected physician from Independence, Kansas, Dr. York had been traveling to visit his brother when he stopped at the Bender Inn in March 1873. His failure to arrive at his destination prompted extensive search efforts that would eventually expose the family's crimes. The circumstances of Dr. York's disappearance were particularly troubling because he was a careful and experienced traveler who would not have taken unnecessary risks or deviated from his planned route without good reason. His horse and buggy were found abandoned near the inn, but there was no initial evidence to explain what had happened to the respected physician. George Loncourt and his infant daughter represented one of the most heartbreaking cases among the Bender victims, as their murders demonstrated the family's willingness to kill even the most innocent travelers when profit was involved. Loncourt had been traveling with a substantial sum of money when he stopped at the inn, making him an attractive target despite the presence of his young child. The murder of an infant required a particular level of moral depravity that shocked even frontier communities accustomed to violence and hardship. The killing of Loncourt's daughter revealed the complete absence of human empathy among the Bender family members and their willingness to eliminate witnesses regardless of age or innocence. Johnny Boyle, an 8-year-old boy who disappeared while traveling with his family, became another symbol of the Benders' indiscriminate brutality. The child's murder was particularly senseless as he posed no threat to the family, and his death would inevitably attract unwanted attention from law enforcement and the community. The pattern of child murders committed by the Benders suggests either complete moral bankruptcy or a calculated decision that killing entire families would reduce the number of potential witnesses and investigators. Either explanation reveals a level of criminal sophistication and callousness that distinguished them from typical frontier criminals. Benjamin Brown, a prominent businessman from Cedarvale, Kansas, had been carrying approximately $2,800 when he disappeared after staying at the Bender Inn. His substantial wealth made him an ideal target for the family's robbery-murder scheme, but his prominence in regional business circles ensured that his disappearance would attract significant attention from law enforcement. The murder of wealthy travelers like Brown provided the Benders with the financial resources necessary to maintain their operations while planning their eventual escape. The substantial sums stolen from such victims allowed the family to appear prosperous and respectable, deflecting suspicion about their true source of income. William Jones and his son had been traveling together when they encountered the Bender family, apparently seeking shelter during bad weather. Their murders demonstrated the opportunistic nature of the family's crimes and their willingness to kill multiple victims when circumstances required it. The killing of traveling families posed additional logistical challenges for the Benders, as they had to subdue multiple victims while preventing escapes or calls for help. The success of such operations revealed their growing expertise in systematic murder and their ability to adapt their methods to different circumstances. John Gebhardt, a German immigrant seeking to establish himself in Kansas, fell victim to the Benders' exploitation of ethnic solidarity and cultural familiarity. The family's claimed German heritage made them appear trustworthy to fellow immigrants who might otherwise have been suspicious of frontier strangers. The targeting of immigrants revealed the Benders' understanding of their victims' psychological vulnerabilities and their willingness to exploit cultural connections for criminal purposes. Immigrants were often ideal victims because they traveled with their life savings and had fewer local connections to investigate their disappearances. The unnamed victims whose bodies were discovered in the Bender orchard represented travelers whose identities were never definitively established, highlighting the transient nature of frontier society and the ease with which people could disappear without trace. These anonymous dead served as stark reminders of the dangers faced by travelers in lawless regions. The difficulty in identifying some victims reflected both the limitations of 19th century record-keeping and the deliberate efforts by the Benders to destroy evidence that might link them to specific crimes. Personal belongings were typically stolen or destroyed, while bodies were often mutilated to prevent identification. The demographic profile of Bender victims reveals clear patterns in the family's target selection, as they consistently chose travelers who appeared wealthy, traveled alone, or in small groups, and had uncertain itineraries that would delay discovery of their disappearances. These criteria maximize profit while minimizing risk of detection. The seasonal distribution of murders reflected both the patterns of travel on frontier roads and the family's adaptation to different operational conditions throughout the year. Spring and summer brought more travelers but also increased surveillance, while winter provided more privacy but fewer potential victims. The geographic origins of victims demonstrated the wide area from which the Bender Inn drew customers, as travelers came from across Kansas and neighboring states. This geographic diversity complicated investigation efforts, while providing the family with access to victims who were unknown to local residents. The economic impact of the murders extended beyond the immediate victims to affect their families and business associates who suffered financial losses due to unexpected deaths and missing funds. The ripple effects of the Bender crimes touched numerous communities throughout the region. The psychological trauma experienced by victims' families was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding their loved ones' fates and the gruesome circumstances of their deaths once the bodies were discovered. The systematic nature of the murders made them particularly horrifying to contemporary sensibilities. The investigation of victim identities provided crucial evidence for law enforcement efforts to understand the scope of the Bender crimes and build cases against the perpetrators. The careful documentation of victim characteristics and circumstances helped establish patterns that confirmed systematic murder rather than random violence. The memorial efforts undertaken by various communities to honor Bender victims reflected both genuine grief for the dead and determination to prevent similar tragedies through improved law enforcement and community vigilance. These commemorative activities helped maintain public interest in capturing the fugitive family members. The legacy of the Bender victims extends beyond their individual tragedies to encompass broader questions about frontier justice, community responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable travelers in lawless regions. Their deaths served as catalysts for improvements in law enforcement and communication systems that would help prevent similar crimes in the future. The unraveling of the Bender family's murder operation began with the persistent efforts of Colonel Alexander York, whose brother Dr. William York had disappeared while traveling through southeastern Kansas in March 1873. Unlike many other missing persons cases on the frontier, Dr. York's disappearance attracted sustained attention because of his prominence in the community and his brother's determination to discover the truth. Colonel York's initial investigation followed the logical pattern of retracing his brother's known route and questioning people who might have seen him during his journey. This methodical approach led him to the Bender Inn, where the family claimed to remember Dr. York, but insisted he had left their establishment safely and continued on his way toward his intended destination. The colonel's first encounter with the Bender family raised subtle suspicions that would prove prophetic in hindsight. Kate Bender's overly helpful manner and detailed recollections of Dr. York's visit seemed somewhat theatrical, while the family's collective anxiety during questioning suggested they were hiding something significant about the missing physician's fate. The inconsistencies in the family's account became more apparent as Colonel York pressed for specific details about his brother's visit and departure. Their inability to provide coherent explanations for certain aspects of Dr. York's stay, combined with their obvious nervousness, convinced the colonel that they knew more than they were admitting about his brother's disappearance. The formation of a search party to investigate the area around the Bender Inn reflected growing community concern about the number of travelers who had disappeared along the Osage Trail. Colonel York's leadership and connections enabled him to organize a systematic search that would have been impossible for the families of less prominent victims. The decision to search the Bender property was complicated by legal questions about property rights and the authority of citizen search parties to conduct investigations on private land. However, the suspicious behavior of the family and the mounting evidence of multiple disappearances provided justification for more aggressive investigative methods. The discovery that the Bender family had suddenly abandoned their inn without warning immediately heightened suspicions about their involvement in the disappearances. Their hasty departure left behind personal belongings and business assets that suggested panic rather than planned relocation, indicating they had fled to avoid detection rather than simply seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The initial search of the abandoned inn revealed disturbing evidence that confirmed suspicions about the family's criminal activities. The unusual depth of the cellar, stains that appeared to be blood, and the discovery of personal belongings from missing travelers provided clear indications that serious crimes had been committed on the property. The excavation of the inn's cellar uncovered a horrifying scene that exceeded even the investigators' worst expectations. The underground chamber contained clear evidence of systematic murder, including bloodstains, murder weapons, and other materials that demonstrated the location had been used as an execution site for multiple victims. The discovery of the first body in the Bender orchard confirmed the searchers' fears and provided concrete evidence of murder, rather than simple disappearance. The condition of the remains and the circumstances of burial indicated systematic killing and disposal rather than accidental death or random violence. The methodical excavation of the orchard revealed additional bodies that demonstrated the true scope of the Bender family's crimes. Each discovery added to the horror of the situation while providing additional evidence about the family's methods and the identity of their victims. The condition of the bodies provided disturbing insights into the family's murder methods and disposal techniques. The evidence of blunt force trauma to skulls, cut throats, and other injuries painted a picture of systematic killing that shocked even experienced law enforcement personnel. The identification of victims became a priority for investigators seeking to understand the full scope of the crimes and notify affected families. The process was complicated by decomposition, missing personal effects, and the family's apparent efforts to prevent identification of their victims. The discovery of Dr. York's body provided the confirmation that Colonel York had feared while giving him the closure necessary to understand his brother's fate. The circumstances of the physician's death matched the pattern observed with other victims, indicating he had been killed using the family's standard murder method. The investigation of the inn's interior revealed additional evidence of systematic killing, including the arrangement of furniture that facilitated the family's murder method and the discovery of tools and weapons used in the crimes. The physical layout of the murder scene provided crucial insights into how the family had operated their killing business. The documentation of the crime scene became crucial for future law enforcement efforts and legal proceedings against the fugitive family members. Detailed records of the evidence discovered at the inn and burial sites would be essential for building criminal cases if the Benders were ever captured. The public reaction to news of the discovery was one of horror and outrage, as frontier communities struggled to comprehend the systematic nature of the crimes and the length of time they had continued without detection. The revelation that a seemingly respectable family had been operating a murder business challenged assumptions about frontier society and safety. The media coverage of the discovery attracted national attention to the case and helped spread information about the fugitive family members throughout the country. Newspaper accounts of the crimes and descriptions of the suspects would prove crucial for law enforcement efforts to track down the perpetrators. The immediate aftermath of the discovery saw the formation of posses and vigilante groups determined to capture the Bender family and bring them to justice. The systematic nature of their crimes had generated public outrage that demanded immediate action rather than patient investigation. The impact on the local community was profound and lasting, as residents struggled to understand how such systematic evil had operated in their midst without detection. The revelation that neighbors had been systematic killers challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and safety in frontier society. The forensic evidence gathered during the investigation of the Bender property would establish important precedents for criminal investigation techniques and provide valuable lessons for future law enforcement efforts. The systematic documentation of the crime scene and evidence would influence investigative methods for generations. The discovery of the Bender crimes marked the end of their murder operation, but the beginning of a manhunt that would continue for years as law enforcement and private investigators sought to bring the fugitive family members to justice. Their escape had denied their victims' families the satisfaction of seeing justice served, creating a lasting sense of injustice that would persist long after the immediate horror of the discoveries had faded. The Bender family's escape from justice was accomplished with the same careful planning and ruthless efficiency that had characterized their murder operation, demonstrating their understanding that discovery was inevitable and that survival required immediate flight. Their disappearance from the inn occurred sometime during the night of May 5, 1873, just days before the search party led by Colonel York would arrive to investigate the property. The timing of their departure suggests the family had received advance warning about the impending investigation, either through their own intelligence networks or from sympathetic contacts in the community. Their ability to flee at exactly the right moment indicates sophisticated planning and preparation that had been in place long before their crimes were discovered. The logistics of their escape were complicated by the need to transport valuable stolen goods while avoiding detection by law enforcement and vigilante groups that would soon be searching for them. The family had accumulated substantial wealth from their victims, but converting this wealth into portable assets required careful planning and advanced preparation. The route of their escape was carefully chosen to avoid main roads and populated areas where they might be recognized or reported to authorities. Their knowledge of frontier geography and transportation networks enabled them to plan an escape route that would minimize the risk of capture while maximizing their chances of reaching safety. The family's decision to split up during their escape was a calculated strategy designed to reduce the risk of all members being captured simultaneously while multiplying the challenges facing their pursuers. This separation required advanced planning and predetermined meeting points that would allow them to reunite after the immediate danger had passed. Kate Bender's escape was facilitated by her public profile as a spiritualist, which provided her with contacts and resources throughout the region that could assist her flight from justice. Her network of clients and correspondents offered potential safe houses and transportation that would be unavailable to her supposed relatives. The younger John Bender's limited intellectual capacity may have made him a liability during the escape, requiring special arrangements to ensure his survival while preventing his capture from compromising the other's freedom. His obvious mental limitations would make him easily identifiable to pursuers while limiting his ability to blend into new communities. Ma Bender's masculine appearance and aggressive personality would have made her equally conspicuous during flight, requiring disguises or alternative identities that could conceal her distinctive characteristics. Her unfeminine demeanor would have been particularly noticeable in 19th century society where gender roles were rigidly defined. John Bender Sr.'s role as the family's leader required him to coordinate the escape while ensuring that all members reached safety and that their stolen wealth was preserved for future use. His responsibilities included planning routes, arranging transportation, and establishing new identities that could withstand scrutiny. The financial resources available for their escape included substantial cash reserves accumulated from their victims, as well as valuable items that could be sold or traded for transportation and supplies. The family's systematic robbery of their murder victims had provided them with the means necessary to fund an elaborate escape operation. The false identities prepared for their escape suggest advanced planning that extended back months or even years before their crimes were discovered. The creation of convincing false papers and background stories required time, resources, and connections that indicated sophisticated criminal organization rather than spontaneous flight. The transportation methods used during their escape likely included a combination of stolen horses, purchased passage on trains or riverboats, and possibly even commercial transportation where they could blend in with legitimate travelers. Their varied approach would have made tracking more difficult for pursuers. The initial destinations chosen for their escape were probably selected to provide temporary safety while they assessed the scope of law enforcement efforts and planned their next moves. These intermediate stops would have allowed them to gather intelligence about pursuit efforts while preparing for longer-term relocation to areas where they could establish new lives under false identities. The support networks that may have assisted the Benders' escape remain largely mysterious, but their success in evading capture suggests they had access to resources and assistance beyond their own capabilities. Whether these networks consisted of criminal associates, spiritualist contacts, or simply sympathetic individuals willing to help fellow immigrants remains unclear. The immediate aftermath of their disappearance saw the formation of multiple posses and search parties determined to track down the fugitive family members. These groups included both official law enforcement personnel and private citizens motivated by outrage over the systematic nature of the Bender crimes and determination to see justice served. The rewards offered for information about the Benders' whereabouts quickly escalated as both government authorities and private individuals contributed funds to encourage public cooperation in the manhunt. The substantial bounties reflected both the heinous nature of their crimes and the determination of their victims' families to see them captured. The investigation of their escape route revealed evidence of careful advanced planning, including cash supplies and prearranged transportation, that suggested the family had been preparing for flight long before their crimes were discovered. This preparation indicated criminal sophistication that challenged contemporary assumptions about frontier criminals. The false leads and mistaken identities that plagued the manhunt demonstrated both the difficulty of tracking fugitives in the 19th century American frontier and the public's eagerness to assist in capturing the notorious family. Numerous innocent individuals were detained or harassed based on resemblances to the wanted criminals. The psychological impact of the Benders' successful escape on their victims' families was devastating, as the failure to capture the perpetrators denied closure and justice to those who had lost loved ones. The knowledge that the killers remained free to potentially commit additional crimes compounded the trauma of their original losses. The expansion of the manhunt beyond Kansas to encompass neighboring states and territories reflected both the mobility of frontier society and law enforcement recognition that the fugitives could travel great distances before detection. Interstate cooperation in criminal investigations was still developing during this period, complicating pursuit efforts. The evolution of the manhunt from immediate pursuit to long-term investigation required different skills and resources as the likelihood of immediate capture diminished. Law enforcement agencies had to balance continued search efforts with other responsibilities while maintaining public confidence in their abilities. The impact on frontier, hospitality, and trust was profound and lasting, as the revelation that the Benders had exploited basic human kindness to commit systematic murder made travelers and innkeepers alike more suspicious of strangers. The crimes had poisoned the well of frontier hospitality that had been essential for survival in harsh conditions. The search for the fugitive Bender family became one of the largest and most sustained manhunts in 19th century American history, involving law enforcement agencies across multiple states and territories, as well as private investigators and vigilante groups determined to bring the notorious killers to justice. The scope and intensity of the pursuit reflected both public outrage over their crimes and the challenges inherent in tracking fugitives across the vast American frontier. The initial phase of the manhunt was hampered by the delayed discovery of the family's escape, which had given them a crucial head start of several days before their absence was noticed and their crimes were uncovered. This time advantage allowed them to put substantial distance between themselves and their pursuers, while law enforcement was still gathering evidence and organizing search efforts. Detective agencies were quickly enlisted to supplement official law enforcement efforts, bringing professional investigative skills and resources to bear on the case. The Pinkerton Detective Agency and other prominent firms assigned experienced operatives to track the fugitives, using techniques that were advanced for their era but limited by 19th century technology and communication systems. The reward system established to encourage public cooperation in the manhunt eventually reached substantial proportions, with combined bounties totaling thousands of dollars for information leading to the capture of family members. These financial incentives motivated widespread public participation in the search while generating numerous false leads that complicated investigative efforts. The coordination between different law enforcement jurisdictions proved challenging due to limited communication systems and unclear authority structures that characterized frontier policing. Messages between agencies could take days or weeks to transmit, making real-time coordination of search efforts nearly impossible across long distances. The development of wanted posters and physical descriptions of the fugitives represented one of the most advanced publicity campaigns of its era, with detailed descriptions and sketches distributed throughout the American frontier. These materials helped standardize identification efforts while ensuring that information about the fugitives reached remote areas where they might seek refuge. The investigation of reported sightings generated a massive paper trail of follow-up investigations, witness interviews, and verification efforts that taxed the resources of participating law enforcement agencies. Many sightings proved to be cases of mistaken identity, but each required thorough investigation to avoid missing genuine leads. The psychological profiling attempts made by investigators represented early efforts to understand criminal behavior and predict fugitive actions based on analysis of their crimes and personalities. These pioneering efforts in criminal psychology provided insights that would influence law enforcement techniques for generations. The interstate nature of the manhunt required unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different states and territories, establishing precedents for multi-jurisdictional criminal investigations that would become standard practice in later eras. The Bender case helped demonstrate both the necessity and the challenges of such cooperation. The role of newspapers and other media in publicizing the manhunt was crucial for maintaining public interest and generating leads from across the country. The sensational nature of the crimes ensured extensive coverage that kept the case in the public eye, while spreading information about the fugitives to areas where law enforcement had limited presence. The formation of vigilante groups dedicated to capturing the Benders reflected both frontier traditions of citizen justice and specific outrage over the systematic nature of their crimes. These groups operated independently of official law enforcement, while sometimes coordinating their efforts with professional investigators. The financial costs of the extended manhunt placed significant strain on law enforcement budgets at local, state, and federal levels. The resources devoted to capturing the Benders represented one of the largest criminal investigations of its era, while demonstrating the economic impact of major criminal cases on government agencies. The international dimensions of the search became apparent as investigators pursued leads, suggesting the fugitives might have fled to Canada, Mexico, or even returned to Europe. The complexity of international law enforcement cooperation in the 19th century made such investigations extremely difficult, but not impossible. The technological limitations that handicapped the manhunt included primitive communication systems, limited transportation networks, and the absence of modern identification techniques such as fingerprinting or photography. Investigators had to rely primarily on witness descriptions and physical evidence that could be easily concealed or altered. The social impact of the manhunt extended beyond law enforcement to affect frontier communities throughout the region, as residents lived in fear that the fugitive family might return or that other similar criminals might be operating undetected. The case had shattered assumptions about safety and trust that were fundamental to frontier society. The legal complexities surrounding the manhunt included questions about jurisdiction, extradition procedures, and the authority of different law enforcement agencies to pursue fugitives across state lines. These issues highlighted gaps in 19th century legal frameworks that would eventually be addressed through federal legislation. The evolution of investigative techniques during the manhunt saw the development of new approaches to evidence collection, witness interviewing, and case documentation that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. The Bender case served as a training ground for investigative methods that were revolutionary for their time. The psychological toll on investigators pursuing the case was significant, as the systematic nature of the crimes and the frustration of unsuccessful pursuit efforts affected the mental health and professional satisfaction of officers involved in the manhunt. The case demonstrated the emotional costs of major criminal investigations on law enforcement personnel. The role of private citizens in supporting the manhunt included financial contributions, volunteer search efforts, and the provision of information and resources to official investigators. This civilian participation demonstrated both public commitment to justice and the limitations of government law enforcement resources in frontier regions. The political implications of the manhunt included pressure on elected officials to demonstrate effective law enforcement while balancing the costs of extended investigations against other governmental priorities. The case became a test of government competence and commitment to protecting citizens from criminal violence. The cultural legacy of the manhunt influenced American attitudes toward law enforcement, criminal justice, and frontier safety for generations. The case helped establish expectations about government responsibility for public safety while demonstrating both the possibilities and limitations of criminal investigation in the American frontier context. The failure to capture the Bender family, despite one of the most extensive manhunts in 19th century American history, generated numerous theories about their ultimate fate and the reasons for their successful escape from justice. These theories ranged from credible explanations based on available evidence to wild speculation that reflected both public fascination with the case and frustration over the lack of resolution. The most widely accepted theory among law enforcement professionals was that the family had successfully reached Mexico or Canada, where they could establish new identities beyond the reach of American authorities. The limited extradition treaties and communication systems of the era would have made tracking fugitives across international borders extremely difficult, providing logical explanations for their disappearance. Alternative theories suggested the Benders had been killed by vigilante groups shortly after their escape, with their bodies disposed of in remote locations where they would never be discovered. This explanation appealed to those who believed frontier justice had ultimately prevailed, even if official law enforcement had failed to capture the fugitives. The possibility that family members had separated permanently and assumed completely new identities in different regions was supported by the practical difficulties of keeping a distinctive group together during extended flight. Each member's individual characteristics would have made group travel increasingly risky as their descriptions became widely known. Conspiracy theories emerged suggesting the Benders had been part of a larger criminal organization that had assisted their escape and provided them with new identities and resources for establishing themselves elsewhere. These theories were supported by the systematic nature of their crimes and the sophisticated planning evident in their escape. The mystery surrounding Kate Bender's true identity fueled speculation that she had not been related to the other family members at all, but had been a professional criminal who had joined their operation for financial gain. Her superior education and social skills seemed inconsistent with a genuine family relationship to the crude and unsophisticated other members. Religious and supernatural explanations for the family's disappearance reflected both Kate's spiritualist practices and contemporary beliefs about divine justice and retribution. Some community members believed the family had been claimed by supernatural forces as punishment for their crimes, while others saw their escape as evidence of demonic assistance. The investigation of reported sightings generated numerous sub-theories about individual family members' fates, with some investigators believing certain members had been captured or killed, while others remained at large. The lack of definitive evidence made it impossible to verify any of these claims or develop coherent explanations for the entire family's disappearance. The possibility that the Benders had returned to criminal activity under new identities was supported by reports of similar crimes in other regions. though none could be definitively linked to the fugitive family members. The systematic nature of their original crimes suggested criminal expertise that would likely resurface elsewhere if they had survived. Economic theories about their escape focused on the substantial wealth they had accumulated from their victims and how this money might have been used to purchase false identities, transportation, and establishment in new communities. The financial resources available to them would have provided options unavailable to typical frontier fugitives. The role of the spiritualist community in potentially assisting Kate's escape generated theories about networks of believers who might have provided shelter and assistance to someone they viewed as possessing genuine supernatural abilities. The spiritualist movement's organization and communication systems could have facilitated her disappearance. Gender-based theories suggested that Kate's status as an attractive woman would have provided her with opportunities for assistance and concealment that would not have been available to her male associates. The social conventions of the era that protected women from certain types of scrutiny could have aided her escape and subsequent survival. Immigration-related theories proposed that the family's claimed German heritage had been fabricated and that they had actually been career criminals from other countries who had entered the United States specifically to exploit frontier conditions for criminal purposes. Their eventual escape might have represented a return to their countries of origin. The mystery of their true names and backgrounds continued to complicate efforts to track them, as investigators remained uncertain about their real identities or personal histories. The possibility that Bender was itself an assumed name made traditional investigative techniques based on family connections and personal history largely useless. Psychological theories about their motivations and behavior patterns attempted to explain both their crimes and their successful escape through analysis of their individual personalities and group dynamics. These early efforts at criminal profiling provided insights that would influence law enforcement approaches to similar cases. The impact of changing social and economic conditions on their ability to remain hidden was considered by investigators who recognized that frontier conditions that had facilitated their crimes were rapidly disappearing as the region became more settled and law enforcement improved. Regional theories suggested the family had relocated to specific areas where their skills and backgrounds would be less conspicuous, such as mining camps, logging communities, or other frontier regions where transient populations and limited law enforcement would provide cover for their activities. The possibility that one or more family members had died of natural causes during their flight was supported by the harsh conditions they would have faced and the stress of extended pursuit. The deaths of key members might have caused the group to dissolve and survivors to abandon their criminal activities. Cultural assimilation theories proposed that the survivors had successfully integrated into established communities where their past crimes were unknown and their new identities were accepted without question. The rapid social changes of the era would have provided numerous opportunities for such integration. And the enduring mystery of the Benders' fate continued to generate new theories and investigations for decades after their disappearance, as each generation of law enforcement professionals and amateur investigators brought new perspectives and techniques to the case. Their successful escape had created one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries. The psychological impact of the unresolved case on the families of victims was profound and lasting, as the absence of closure and justice created ongoing trauma that affected multiple generations. The failure to capture the perpetrators had denied the satisfaction of seeing justice served, while leaving open the possibility that the killers might still be alive and free. The influence of the Bender case on American criminal justice and law enforcement was significant and long-lasting, demonstrating both the need for improved investigative techniques and interstate cooperation while highlighting the challenges inherent in pursuing fugitives across vast and sparsely populated territories. The Bloody Benders disappeared into the mists of American frontier history, leaving behind a legacy of terror that would influence law enforcement practices and popular culture for generations to come. Their successful escape from justice created one of the nation's most enduring unsolved mysteries, while demonstrating the challenges inherent in maintaining law and order across the vast expanses of the 19th century American frontier. The immediate impact of the Bender crimes on frontier hospitality was profound and lasting, as travelers became suspicious of roadside inns and isolated establishments that had previously been welcome refuges during long journeys. The knowledge that systematic killers had operated under the guise of respectable innkeepers poisoned the well of trust that had been essential for survival in harsh frontier conditions. The legal precedents established during the investigation and manhunt contributed to the development of improved law enforcement coordination and investigative techniques that would serve American criminal justice for decades. The case demonstrated both the necessity and the challenges of multi-jurisdictional cooperation, while highlighting gaps in legal frameworks that would eventually be addressed through federal legislation. The technological innovations prompted by the manhunt included improvements in communication systems, identification techniques, and record-keeping that would enhance law enforcement capabilities throughout the American frontier. The frustrations encountered during the pursuit of the Benders motivated investments in infrastructure and technology that would prevent similar failures in future cases. The cultural impact of the Bender story extended far beyond its immediate geographic region to influence American attitudes toward frontier safety, criminal justice, and the nature of evil itself. The case became part of national folklore while serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk beneath facades of respectability and hospitality. The influence on American literature and popular culture was immediate and enduring, as the Bender story provided material for countless novels, plays, and eventually films that explored themes of frontier violence and the corruption of American innocence. The family's systematic approach to murder made them particularly compelling subjects for creators seeking to examine the dark side of the American dream. The impact on law enforcement training and education included the development of new approaches to criminal investigation, evidence collection, and case management that incorporated lessons learned from the Bender manhunt. The case served as a training example for generations of law enforcement professionals while demonstrating both successful and unsuccessful investigative techniques. The economic consequences of the crimes extended beyond their immediate victims to affect the broader development of southeastern Kansas and surrounding regions. The negative publicity associated with the murders discouraged settlement and investment while creating lasting associations between the area and frontier violence that would persist for decades. The social changes prompted by the Bender crimes included increased community vigilance, improved communication between settlements, and the development of mutual aid networks designed to protect travelers and identify suspicious activities. These community-based security measures represented grassroots responses to the failure of official law enforcement to prevent or solve the crimes. The psychological studies of the case contributed to early developments in criminal psychology and the understanding of serial killing behavior. The systematic nature of the Bender crimes provided researchers with insights into criminal motivation and organization that would influence both academic study and practical law enforcement approaches to similar cases. The international attention attracted by the case helped establish America's reputation for frontier violence while demonstrating both the opportunities and dangers inherent in the nation's rapid westward expansion. Foreign observers used the Bender story as evidence of the lawlessness that characterized American frontier society. The political implications of the case included pressure on government officials to improve law enforcement capabilities and provide better protection for citizens venturing into frontier regions. The failure to capture the Benders became a political liability that motivated investments in territorial law enforcement and judicial systems. The religious and philosophical questions raised by the crimes included debates about the nature of evil, the effectiveness of divine justice, and the moral obligations of communities to protect travelers and strangers. The case challenged contemporary assumptions about human nature and the progress of civilization in frontier regions. The investigative techniques pioneered during the manhunt influenced American law enforcement practices for generations while establishing precedents for major criminal investigations that would be refined and improved over time. The case served as both positive and negative example of investigative methods and their limitations. The memorial efforts undertaken to honor the Bender victims included the establishment of markers and monuments that served both to commemorate the dead and to warn future travelers about the dangers they might face. These commemorative activities helped maintain public interest in the case while providing focal points for community healing and resolution. The educational value of the case for law enforcement training and criminal justice education continued for decades as new generations of investigators studied the crimes and manhunt to understand both successful and unsuccessful approaches to major criminal cases. The Bender story became a standard case study in criminal investigation courses. The ongoing searches for evidence of the family's ultimate fate continued sporadically for decades after their disappearance, as amateur investigators and law enforcement professionals pursued new leads and theories about their survival or deaths. These continued efforts demonstrated both public fascination with the case and determination to achieve some form of resolution. The influence on frontier architecture and in design included security measures and layout modifications intended to prevent similar crimes while maintaining the hospitality necessary for legitimate business operations. The physical legacy of the Bender crimes could be seen in the defensive measures adopted by subsequent frontier establishments. The impact on American concepts of hospitality and trust had lasting effects on social relationships and business practices throughout frontier regions. The knowledge that killers had exploited traditional hospitality to commit systematic murder created suspicions and defensive behaviors that would persist long after frontier conditions had disappeared. The ultimate historical significance of the Bloody Benders lies not only in their crimes, but in their demonstration of how evil could flourish in the gaps and spaces of an expanding nation where law enforcement was weak and social bonds were fragile. Their story serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of strong institutions and community vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members. The Bender family's transformation of a symbol of frontier hospitality into an instrument of systematic murder represents one of the most complete corruptions of American ideals in the nation's criminal history. Their legacy continues to influence American culture and law enforcement while serving as an eternal warning about the monsters that can hide behind masks of respectability and kindness. In the end, the Bloody Benders achieved a form of immortality that they never sought through their crimes, becoming permanent fixtures in American folklore and criminal history. Their story continues to fascinate and horrify new generations, while serving as a testament to both the capacity for human evil and the importance of justice in civilized society. The empty prairie where their inn once stood serves as a silent monument to their victims and a reminder of the price paid for the settlement of the American frontier. The blood they spilled in pursuit of wealth and power ultimately purchased them nothing but infamy and exile, demonstrating the ultimate futility of building prosperity on foundations of systematic murder and betrayal. Let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.